Hey there, tonight we're diving into the jolly origins of the first, modern, Christmas in the 19th century, where the truth is that festive trees once sparked more curiosity than cheer in most living rooms. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. The Victorian era. The time when Christmas went from a humble, slightly pagan celebration to an all-out festive marathon complete with trees, cards, and enough tinsel to blind a small village. And it all kicked off with a royal couple who were basically the 19th century equivalent of a social media influencer power couple. I'm talking about Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert. These two were the original trendsetters who made Christmas trees cool again. You see, before Victoria and Albert, the idea of bringing a tree into your home to celebrate Christmas was about as common as finding a unicorn in your backyard. Sure, some folks in Germany were already doing it, but in England, not so much. It was just a quirky thing those Germans did. Enter Prince Albert, the dashing German import, who brought not only his charm, but also this peculiar custom to the British Isles when he married Victoria in 1840. By 1848, an illustration of the royal family gathered around their decorated Christmas tree appeared in the Illustrated London News, and boom! Suddenly, everybody wanted a piece of that holiday magic. The timing couldn't have been better. The 19th century was a period of tremendous change, with the Industrial Revolution spinning its wheels faster than a hamster on caffeine. This economic boom meant more disposable income for the burgeoning middle class, who were eager to emulate their betters in everything from fashion to, you guessed it, holiday traditions. The Christmas tree, once a symbol of the aristocracy, found its way into the parlors of the middle class, complete with handcrafted ornaments and candles precariously balanced on branches. Because nothing says Christmas like a potential house fire, right? But let's not gloss over the origins of this whole tree-in-the-living-room business. Christmas trees have a past steeped in pagan traditions. Long before they became the centerpiece of Victorian holiday cheer, trees were revered by ancient cultures who saw them as symbols of life and renewal during the cold, dark winter months. Bringing greenery inside during winter solstice was a way to keep spirits high and remind folks that spring wasn't too far off. Fast forward to the Victorian era, and all those pagan roots got a polished Christian veneer, making the Christmas tree a respectable, even pious, addition to the holiday lineup. Now, the Victorians weren't just about slapping a few ornaments on a tree and calling it a day. Oh no. They were nothing if not thorough. They brought an almost obsessive attention to detail to their holiday celebrations. Trees were adorned with homemade decorations, such as paper flowers, candies, and strings of popcorn and cranberries. Glass baubles, imported from Germany, were the must-have items for those looking to flex their festive flair. And let's not forget those literal tree candles. Apparently, the thrill of a festive blaze was as much a part of the holiday spirit as mulled wine. The cultural shift was palpable. The Christmas tree transformed from a quaint German tradition into a symbol of familial harmony and social aspiration. It was the ultimate status symbol, proudly displayed in the window for all to see. And if you didn't have one, well, you might as well have been living in the Dark Ages. The influence of the British Empire meant that this tradition quickly spread to other parts of the world, including the United States, where it was embraced with the kind of enthusiasm only Americans can muster. But here's the kicker. The Victorians managed to commercialize Christmas long before it was cool. With the rise of department stores and mass production, Christmas became not just a time for family and reflection, but also a season of consumerism. The Victorians had a knack for turning anything into an opportunity to shop, and Christmas was no exception. Retailers were quick to capitalize, offering everything from ornaments to gifts, which of course had to be placed under the tree. It's as if they knew that the path to a person's heart is paved with shiny things and carefully wrapped boxes. In essence, the 19th century Christmas tree was a perfect blend of old-world charm and new-world capitalism. It was a tradition that married the sacred and the secular, the natural and the industrial. It was a symbol of hope, of family, and let's be real, of keeping up with the Joneses, or in this case, the Windsors. So, next time you find yourself untangling lights or sweeping up pine needles, give a nod to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, because without them, your December might look a whole lot less sparkly. And while we're on the subject of festive transformations, let's talk about Christmas cards. Enter Sir Henry Cole, the man who turned the humble holiday greeting into a Victorian sensation. In 1843, Sir Henry was in a bit of a pickle. A prominent civil servant and all-around busybody, Cole found himself inundated with seasonal well-wishes that required a response. Now, in today's world of instant messaging and emoji-laden texts, this might not seem like a big deal. But back then, each reply meant painstakingly writing out a letter by hand. Ain't nobody got time for that, right? So, in a stroke of genius, or perhaps sheer laziness, Sir Henry commissioned the first commercial Christmas card. He hired artist John Calcott Horsley to design a card featuring a festive scene of a family merrily raising their glasses. The card also included the rather generic but all-encompassing message, "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you." Simple, yet effective. And just like that, the Christmas card was born, a nifty little invention that saved people from writer's cramp while still spreading holiday cheer. This brainchild of convenience quickly evolved into a booming industry, thanks to the wonders of industrialization. With the advent of the printing press, cards could be produced en masse, making them affordable for the burgeoning middle class. By the 1860, sending Christmas cards became a full-blown tradition, with more than 5 million cards sent during the 1870 Christmas season alone. Talk about a postal workout. Of course, not all early Christmas cards were the epitome of good taste. The Victorians had a peculiar sense of humor, to say the least. Some cards featured bizarre images like anthropomorphic frogs in top hats or unsettling scenes of insects having what appeared to be a holiday feast. One particularly memorable design showed a child being chased by a giant wasp, because nothing says season's greetings quite like nightmare fuel, right? These cards weren't just about spreading cheer. They were also a testament to the era's fascination with the strange and surreal. The oddities in design reflected a society reveling in new technologies and ideas, even if some were downright peculiar. But hey, if the Victorians could mix tinsel with potential house fires, why not throw in a giant wasp for good measure? Economically, the Christmas card boom was a stroke of genius. It created jobs and stimulated the market for paper goods, inks, and postal services. Printers and artists found themselves in high demand, and the postal service had its hands full delivering millions of seasonal missives. The cards became a symbol of the economic prosperity brought about by the Industrial Revolution, much like the Christmas tree had become a symbol of social aspiration. And let's not forget the unintended consequence of all this card sending, the solidification of Christmas as a time for connection and goodwill. In a rapidly expanding urban society, where neighbors could be strangers, these cards served as a bridge, a way to keep in touch with loved ones near and far. They were a tangible reminder that someone, somewhere, was thinking of you. A small gesture that packed a powerful emotional punch. So, while the Victorians might have had an oddball sense of aesthetics, they were onto something with their holiday innovations. The Christmas card, much like the tree before it, became more than just a fad. It was a reflection of a society in transition, embracing both tradition and modernity. It was a small piece of paper with a big impact, capturing the spirit of a season that was being redefined for a new age. As we dive deeper into the world of Victorian Christmases, it's essential to remember that these traditions didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were the result of social, economic, and technological changes that were reshaping the world. The Christmas card was a product of its time, a perfect blend of practicality, innovation, and let's be honest, a dash of eccentricity. And there you have it, the curious case of the Christmas card, a story of necessity and creativity, of odd designs and heartfelt connections. It's a reminder that even the most mundane objects can have extraordinary histories. So, the next time you find yourself sending out cards during the holiday rush, take a moment to appreciate the journey that little piece of paper has taken, from Sir Henry Cole's desk to your mailbox. As we continue exploring the evolution of Christmas, we'll see how these seemingly simple traditions have become the cornerstones of the holiday season, each with its own unique tale to tell. And speaking of traditions that have taken on a life of their own, let's unwrap the curious evolution of Christmas gift-giving. Once upon a time, exchanging gifts during the holiday season was about as modest as a Victorian lady's ankle. We're talking small tokens like handcrafted trinkets, maybe a knitted scarf if you were feeling particularly generous. But then the 19th century consumer revolution waltzed into the room, and suddenly the humble gift transformed into a grandiose display of affection, or perhaps obligation. Let's paint the scene. The Industrial Revolution had turbocharged economies faster than a steam-powered locomotive. Goods were being churned out with unprecedented speed, and suddenly there was a bounty of items just waiting to be wrapped in festive paper. By the mid-1800, the middle class had more disposable income, and what better way to flex that newfound wealth than through lavish gifts. It was like a Victorian version of Keeping Up with the Kardashians, but with more lace and fewer Instagram filters. Now, here's where we bust some myths. It's tempting to view this shift as a heartwarming tale of generosity and goodwill, a romantic notion that the Victorians were simply overflowing with the spirit of giving. But don't let the rosy glow of candlelight fool you. The commercialization of Christmas was driven by a potent mix of marketing savvy and good old-fashioned peer pressure. Retailers, who were basically the 19th century equivalent of modern-day influencers, realized there was gold in them far hills of holiday cheer. They started marketing Christmas as the ultimate gift-giving occasion, complete with advertisements that would make even the most stoic Ebenezer Scrooge feel a twinge of guilt if he didn't partake. And partake they did. By the 1880, department stores were transforming their windows into winter wonderlands, each display more elaborate than the last, all in a bid to entice shoppers inside. You see, shopping had become an event, a social outing, and what better excuse to stroll through the aisles than to find the perfect present for dear Aunt Mildred. The pressure to find not just any gift, but the right gift, was immense. It was as if the fate of your social standing rested on the quality of the trinket you presented. And let's not forget the children, those pint-sized arbiters of holiday joy. The expectation to shower them with toys and treats was growing at a pace rivaling that of a sugar-fueled tantrum. Case in point, the explosion of toy production. In 1843, the same year Sir Henry Cole was busy inventing the Christmas card, the first toy department opened in London's Whiteley's department store. By the 1860, toys were a staple of the Christmas market, with everything from wooden soldiers to elaborate doll houses lining the shelves. And these weren't just playthings, they were status symbols. Giving your child the latest toy was akin to posting a humble brag on social media today. It was a public declaration that you were indeed keeping up with the Joneses, or the Carnegies, as it were. But wait, there's more. The idea that gift-giving is solely an altruistic endeavor is as much a fairy tale as Santa himself. The Victorians, astute as ever, understood that gifts were as much about social currency as they were about affection. A well-chosen gift could solidify alliances, curry favor, or even smooth over the most awkward of family squabbles. It was social engineering wrapped in a bow, a way to navigate the intricate web of relationships with all the finesse of a seasoned diplomat. And speaking of bows, let's not overlook the role of Christmas wrapping. By the late 1800, the art of gift wrapping had become an essential part of the holiday ritual. Initially, gifts were simply wrapped in brown paper, but that was about as exciting as a lump of coal. Enter the Victorian penchant for embellishment, and soon wrapping paper transformed into a riot of colors and patterns, complete with ribbons and lace. It was the icing on the proverbial fruitcake, a final flourish that made the gift as much a feast for the eyes as it was for the heart. Of course, all this gifting and wrapping didn't come cheap. The Victorians weren't just spending their pocket change on Christmas. They were investing in it. In 1890, Americans alone spent an estimated $25 million on Christmas presents, equivalent to about $750 million today. That's a whole lot of chestnuts roasting on an open fire, and an indication of just how deeply consumerism had embedded itself into the fabric of Christmas. So, what does this all mean for our modern holiday traditions? Well, it seems the Victorians set the stage for the gift-giving frenzy we know and love today. They took a quaint custom and transformed it into a full-blown extravaganza, complete with all the trappings of commerce and social obligation. And while we might like to think we've evolved past the pressures of consumerism, one glance at a Black Friday sale might suggest otherwise. As we continue our journey through the annals of Christmas history, it's essential to remember that these traditions are more than just relics of the past. They're a reflection of the ever-changing societal landscape, a testament to our enduring desire to connect, to celebrate, and yes, to give, whether out of love, duty, or a little bit of both. So next time you find yourself in a holiday shopping frenzy, spare a thought for the Victorians who started it all, turning Christmas into the gift-giving gala it is today. And stay tuned, because there's still more to unwrap about this fascinating holiday evolution. And speaking of holiday excess, let's carve into the centerpiece of any Christmas feast, the dinner itself. Yes, the traditional Christmas dinner, that sprawling spread of culinary delights that we now associate with the holiday, didn't exactly start off as a Dickensian cornucopia of joy. In fact, before the Victorians got their hands on it, Christmas dinner was about as exciting as a Tuesday night supper. Think humble pies, and maybe a roasted bird if you were living large. But then, the Industrial Revolution came along and played Santa with a bag full of technological advancements that transformed the holiday menu from ho-hum to ho-ho-holy cow. That's a lot of food. Let's chew on the facts. The advent of railways, improved food preservation techniques, and advances in agriculture made it possible to transport fresh produce and meats over long distances. Suddenly, exotic ingredients weren't just the domain of the upper crust. The middle class could now afford to throw a feast that would make Henry Roman VIII envious. Consider the turkey, now the undisputed king of the Christmas table. Before the 19th century, most families were more likely to chow down on a goose or beef, both of which were cheaper and more readily available. But thanks to the wonders of rail transport and the increasing efficiency of farming, turkeys went from being a rare luxury to a staple of the holiday menu. By the 1850, the bird had waddled its way into the hearts and stomachs of the British middle class, with a little help from Charles Dickens, whose A Christmas Carol immortalized the turkey as the Cratchit's dream meal. And it wasn't just meat that got a holiday makeover. The Victorians were the original foodies, eager to experiment with new flavors and dishes. The rise of imported goods meant that spices and fruits from far-off lands became accessible to the average family. Oranges from Spain and sugar from the Caribbean transformed Christmas pudding from a starchy mix of oats and suet into a sweet, boozy delight, rich enough to send any Victorian into a food coma. Speaking of sweets, let's not forget the role of sugar in this culinary revolution. In 1800, sugar was a luxury item, costing about 16 pence per pound. But by the middle of the century, it had dropped to just 3 pence per pound, thanks to increased production and the global trade boom. This sugar rush allowed the creation of elaborate desserts, like mince pies and plum pudding, that were as much a feast for the eyes as for the palate. The Victorians weren't just stuffing their faces. They were indulging in a sensory experience, one that combined taste, smell, and the visual spectacle of an opulent table setting. But let's not sugarcoat the reality. The sumptuous Christmas dinner was as much about status as it was about sustenance. In a world where appearances mattered, hosting a lavish feast was a way to showcase one's social standing. It was a culinary arms race, where the size of your turkey and the opulence of your trimmings were a reflection of your place in society. This wasn't just a meal. It was a public declaration of prosperity, a way to assert one's position in the social hierarchy. And let's talk leftovers, not the kind you store in Tupperware for a week, but the societal leftovers. While the middle class reveled in their newfound ability to host extravagant feasts, the working class often struggled to keep up with the Joneses. For many, the burden of providing a Christmas dinner that met societal expectations was daunting, leading to financial strain and even debt. It's the Dickensian tale of two Christmases, one of abundance and one of austerity, all wrapped up in the same holiday bow. But here's the twist. This evolution in Christmas dining wasn't just a reflection of economic disparity. It was also a catalyst for change. The visible divide between the haves and have-nots sparked a wave of charitable efforts, with the more fortunate inspired. or guilted into hosting communal feasts and donating food to those in need. It was a season of giving born out of a season of excess, a paradox that resonates even today. Now, let's slice into the role of technology in this gastronomic transformation. The advent of the steam engine and the expansion of the railway network revolutionized the way food was distributed. By the 1850, the British Isles were crisscrossed by over 6,000 miles of railway tracks, making it possible to transport fresh produce from the countryside to the cities in record time. This meant that urban dwellers could enjoy fresh meat and vegetables that were once the exclusive preserve of rural folk. And with refrigeration technology still in its infancy, the Victorians got creative. Ice houses became all the rage, allowing wealthier families to store perishable goods for longer. Meanwhile, the invention of canning in the early 19th century opened up a world of preserved fruits and meats, ensuring that even the most perishable of ingredients could grace the Christmas table. Of course, this newfound culinary freedom came with its own set of challenges. The pressure to create a picture-perfect Christmas dinner was immense, with homemakers, mostly women, bearing the brunt of the workload. Cookbooks from the era are a testament to the complexity of Victorian holiday cooking, with recipes that read more like engineering manuals than culinary guides. It was as if the success of the holiday hinged on the ability to execute a multi-course meal with the precision of a military operation. But let's not forget the social dynamics at play here. The Christmas dinner was more than just a meal. It was a stage on which family dynamics were played out. The head of the household was expected to carve the turkey with the grace of a maestro, while the matriarch orchestrated the feast like a seasoned conductor. It was a delicate balancing act, one that required not just culinary skill, but also the ability to navigate the complex web of family relationships. In the end, the Victorian Christmas dinner was a microcosm of the era's societal shifts, a reflection of both progress and disparity, abundance and want. It was a tradition that evolved in tandem with the world around it, shaped by technological advances, economic changes, and the ever-present pressure to keep up with the Joneses or the Cratchits. As we continue to unwrap the layers of this holiday transformation, remember, the Christmas dinner is more than just a meal. It's a slice of history, served with a side of societal insight and a sprinkle of holiday magic. Stay tuned, because there's still plenty more to feast on in the world of Victorian Christmases. And so, as the Victorian dinner table groaned under the weight of its culinary extravagance, it's worth pausing to consider the broader implications of these festive innovations. While today's holiday season feels like a marathon of shopping, cooking, and strained family gatherings, much of this chaos has its roots in the 19th century. The Victorians didn't just invent Christmas as we know it. They set the stage for our modern holiday hustle, complete with all its joys, stresses, and occasional existential dread. Let's start by debunking the myth that the Victorian era was a quaint, idyllic time when everyone gathered around the hearth singing carols. Sure, the imagery is lovely, but the reality was a bit more Dickensian, if you will. The notion of a perfect Christmas was as much a social construct back then as it is now. The pressures to conform to specific traditions and the financial strain of doing so were very real. For many, the holiday season was as much about keeping up appearances as it was about genuine merriment. The economic context is key here. The Industrial Revolution gave rise to a burgeoning middle class with newfound disposable income, but it also widened the gap between rich and poor. The lavish Christmases of the wealthy were often juxtaposed against the stark realities faced by the working class. This disparity wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Charles Dickens, in his classic tale, A Christmas Carol, highlighted the excesses of the era while simultaneously championing the spirit of generosity and community. And while Scrooge's transformation is heartwarming, let's not forget that the Cratchits' Christmas was still a modest affair, albeit one rich in love and warmth. Culturally, the Victorian Christmas was a melting pot of traditions, both old and new. The fusion of pagan customs, Christian symbolism, and the allure of consumerism created a holiday that was simultaneously ancient and modern. The Christmas tree, once a pagan symbol of life, became a beacon of Christian joy and social aspiration. Similarly, the act of gift-giving, which began as a humble exchange of tokens, morphed into a commercial juggernaut, driven by both genuine affection and societal pressure. This duality is at the heart of Christmas' enduring appeal and its occasional controversy. The legacy of these Victorian traditions is both profound and paradoxical. On one hand, they laid the groundwork for the modern Christmas experience, complete with all its rituals and traditions. On the other, they also set the stage for the commercialization of the holiday, turning it into a season of consumerism as much as a time of reflection. It's a dichotomy that's as relevant today as it was in the 19th century, a reminder that while the trappings of Christmas may change, the underlying human desires for connection, celebration, and status remain remarkably consistent. Now, let's not kid ourselves. Nostalgia for the Victorian Christmas is as much a product of selective memory as it is historical fact. We tend to romanticize the past, conveniently glossing over its less savory aspects in favor of a more palatable narrative. But history, like fruitcake, is best appreciated in all its complexity, with a mix of sweet and bitter notes. The Victorian era was a time of immense social change and innovation, but it was also a period marked by inequality and hardship. The Christmas traditions that emerged from this era are a testament to both humanity's creativity and its contradictions. So, as you hang your baubles and sip your eggnog, spare a thought for the Victorians who started it all. They were the original architects of the modern Christmas, crafting a holiday that reflects both the best and worst of human nature. Whether you're decking the halls or dodging holiday stress, remember that you're part of a long tradition, one that has evolved over centuries, but remains rooted in the same fundamental human desires. Finally, let's wrap this up with a bow, shall we? The enduring legacy of Victorian Christmas customs is a testament to their resilience and adaptability. They've weathered the changing tides of history, evolving to fit the needs and desires of each new generation. In a world that's constantly shifting, these traditions offer a sense of continuity, a reminder that, no matter how much things change, some things remain comfortingly familiar. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real magic of Christmas, not in the gifts or the glitter, but in the shared stories and traditions that bind us together, year after year. So here's to the Victorians, the original holiday trendsetters. They may not have had Instagram to document their festive feats, but their influence is undeniable. As you gather with loved ones this season, remember that you're not just celebrating a holiday. You're participating in a rich tapestry of history, woven together by the threads of human experience. And if that doesn't make you feel all warm and fuzzy, well, there's always mulled wine. The ancient Egyptian social structure wasn't just a hierarchy, it was a pyramid scheme on a grand scale, with the pharaoh sitting pretty at the top, like the ultimate CEO/god. You see, pharaohs weren't just royalty, they were divine beings in human form, the ultimate influencers of their time, with a following that put even the Kardashians to shame. When a pharaoh sneezed, the entire kingdom caught a cold. Now, pharaohs had an entourage that could rival a modern pop star's backstage crew. At the front of this glam squad were the nobles and viziers, the ultimate power brokers. These guys were the pharaoh's right-hand men, the ones who actually got things done while the pharaohs were busy being divine. You might think of them as the ancient Egyptian version of a cabinet, but with more gold and fewer scandals. Well, at least fewer that we know of. To give you a sense of scale, Egypt's economy was like a well-oiled machine, powered by the Nile's annual floods. The pharaohs controlled this economy with an iron grip, ensuring that the grain flowed as predictably as the river itself. Taxes. Oh, they had taxes, all right. The pharaohs were masters of the tax code long before the IRS was even an idea. They taxed everything from crops to labor, and this revenue fed the lavish lifestyles of the elite. That's right, those enormous tombs and temples weren't built on goodwill alone. They were the result of a highly organized system that squeezed every last bit of productivity from its subjects. Look, let's not romanticize this too much. The pharaohs maintained power not just by claiming divine right, but through clever politicking. Marriages, alliances, and a bit of good old-fashioned propaganda were the tools of their trade. Even the guards were drafted into the PR campaign, with the pharaohs often portrayed as the beloved of deities like Ra and Osiris. They weren't just rulers, they were the living embodiment of the divine order, a marketing strategy that would make even the shrewdest modern politician envious. But let's not forget the sweat and toil behind the grandeur. Those jaw-dropping pyramids, they weren't built by aliens or slaves, as some myths would have you believe. Nope, they were constructed by skilled laborers who worked in shifts, fed by a state-sponsored system that ensured they had bread and beer. Yes, beer was a staple, in exchange for their labor. These laborers were the unsung heroes of ancient Egypt, the ones who turned limestone blocks into legends. Pharaohs like Ramses II, who reigned for a whopping 66 years, starting in 1279 B.C., understood the power of image. Ramses, known as the Great, was a master of self-promotion. He left his mark on Egypt's landscape with temples, statues, and monuments galore, all designed to remind everyone just who was in charge. The message was clear. I am Ramses, and I build big things. His reign wasn't just about military campaigns. It was about crafting a legacy that would stand the test of time, or at least until the next guy came along and tried to one-up him. But let's not kid ourselves. Maintaining such power was no walk in the desert. The pharaohs had to keep a close eye on the economy, ensuring that the granaries were full and the people were fed. An empty stomach could turn even the most devout follower into a revolutionary, and pharaohs were well aware of this. So they played the long game, balancing divine right with practical governance, a bit like juggling gold-plated balls while riding a chariot. The nobles and viziers were crucial in this balancing act. They were the administrators, the ones who kept the kingdom running smoothly. They collected taxes, managed the lands, and ensured that the pharaoh's policies were implemented without a hitch. It wasn't just about power. It was about keeping the machine well-oiled and running, ensuring that the pharaoh's vision for Egypt was realized. Now, let's address the elephant, or should I say, the sphinx, in the room. Those lavish lifestyles of the pharaohs and their inner circle were supported by an intricate tax system that would make modern accountants weep. The pharaohs extracted wealth from every corner of their kingdom, and this wealth was funneled into building projects, military campaigns, and of course, their own sumptuous palaces. The wealth disparity was as stark as the Nile's floodplains, with the elite living in opulence while the average Egyptian toiled away to make it all possible. And those tombs, they were the ultimate retirement plan, a way for the pharaohs to ensure their place in the afterlife. The tombs were filled with treasures and goods that they believed would accompany them into eternity, a practice that speaks volumes about their views on wealth and power. These were not just final resting places. They were statements of eternal dominance, a way to say, I was here, and I mattered. In the end, the pharaohs were more than just rulers. They were architects of a society that revolved around them like the sun around the earth. Their ability to maintain power lay in their skillful navigation of politics, economy, and religion, a trifecta that ensured their place at the top of the pyramid, both literally and figuratively. And while we might marvel at their achievements, it's worth remembering the countless hands that built their legacy, the laborers and artisans whose names are lost to history, but whose work endures in stone and sand. So, next time you're awestruck by the majesty of the pyramids or the grandeur of Luxor, give a nod to the pharaohs who orchestrated it all and to the countless Egyptians who made it possible. In a world where power was as precarious as the shifting sands, the pharaohs managed not just to survive, but to thrive, leaving behind a legacy that continues to captivate our imagination thousands of years later. If you thought the pharaohs were the only stars in the Egyptian show, think again. While they were busy being the divine celebrities of the Nile, the scribes and priests were the backstage crew making sure the whole production didn't fall apart. Imagine them as the ancient Egyptian IT department, keeping everything running while the pharaohs took all the credit. Without these guys, the pharaohs' grandiose plans would have been nothing more than sandcastles at high tide. Let's start with the scribes. These folks were the OG data crunchers, the Excel gurus of the ancient world. They were the ones who knew their way around a reed pen and a piece of papyrus, and in a world where literacy was as rare as an accurate weather forecast, that made them indispensable. If you wanted to get anything done in ancient Egypt, you needed a scribe. These guys were the bureaucrats who kept the machine well-oiled, recording everything from grain harvests to legal disputes. Talk about job security. The ability to read and write was a golden ticket in ancient Egypt. It was the kind of privilege that could elevate you from commoner to elite, provided you had the right connections. The education of a scribe began early, usually around the age of 5, and it was a long haul, think entry-level intern, but for about a decade. They were drilled in the art of hieroglyphics, the original emoji, and learned to manipulate numbers with a skill that would make any modern accountant jealous. By the time they were fully trained, scribes were part of a select group who could read the sacred texts and understand the bureaucratic jargon. In a society that valued tradition and continuity, scribes were the keepers of knowledge, the ones who ensured that the laws of truth, balance, and cosmic order were upheld. But let's not pretend it was all dry scrolls and dusty offices. Scribes had a bit of flair, too. They were known for their creative accounting methods, which could sometimes stretch the truth as far as the Nile in flood season. Need to make sure the temple coffers look a bit fuller for the annual audit. No problem. Just a little papyrus magic, and voila. It's no wonder they were often portrayed with a mischievous grin in tomb paintings. After all, who's going to question the numbers when you're the only one who can read them? Then there were the priests, the spiritual heavyweights of the era. These guys were the ultimate middlemen between the gods and humanity, and they took their job very seriously. The priesthood was a career that offered both prestige and power, a chance to rub shoulders with the divine while enjoying the perks of a well-connected life. The higher you climbed in the priestly ranks, the closer you got to the ear of the gods and the pharaoh. Talk about networking opportunities. The daily grind for a priest involved a lot more than just waving incense and chanting hymns. They were responsible for maintaining the temples, which were the epicenters of Egyptian religious life. Think of these temples as the ancient equivalents of a government office, a bank, and a community center all rolled into one. Priests had to ensure the gods were happy, and in a pantheon as crowded as Egypt's, that was no small task. From dawn till dusk, they performed rituals, made offerings, and kept the divine machinery humming. It was like being on a perpetual spiritual treadmill. No wonder they needed a small army of assistants. And let's not forget the economic clout of the temples. They owned vast tracts of land, employed thousands, and were among the wealthiest institutions in the kingdom. This wasn't just about spirituality. It was about cold, hard cash. The priests, knowing which side their bread was buttered on, were adept at keeping the guards appeased and the temple coffers full. They understood that a well-fed guard was more likely to grant favorable Nile floods, which in turn kept the agricultural economy and the kingdom thriving. But here's the kicker. Priests didn't just serve the gods, they became them. Upon death, high-ranking priests were often deified, ensuring their influence extended beyond the grave. It was the ultimate retirement plan, a celestial 400 one, that promised eternal prestige. In a society obsessed with the afterlife, this was the jackpot. The relationship between scribes, priests, and pharaohs was symbiotic, like a well-choreographed dance. Pharaohs relied on scribes for administration and on priests to legitimize their rule by portraying it as divinely ordained. In return, scribes and priests enjoyed the protection and favor of the throne, ensuring their positions were secure. It was a delicate balance that required constant negotiation and a bit of healthy skepticism. After all, when gods and kings are in the mix, you can bet there's a lot of smoke and mirrors involved. So, what's the takeaway? In ancient Egypt, knowledge was power, and those who wielded it, scribes and priests, were the true movers and shakers. They were the ones who kept the system running smoothly, ensuring that the pharaohs could maintain their image as living gods. Behind every great pharaoh was a cadre of skilled scribes and cunning priests, pulling the strings and keeping the illusion of divine order intact. As we dig deeper into the lives of these ancient bureaucrats and holy men, remember that their stories are not just relics of the past. They offer a glimpse into a world where the written word was sacred, the favor of the gods was paramount, and the pursuit of power was as relentless as the desert sun. In the grand tapestry of history, the scribes and priests were the weavers, crafting a narrative that has endured for millennia. And as we continue to explore their world, one thing is clear. While the pharaohs may have ruled from the top, it was these unsung heroes who kept the whole pyramid from crumbling down. And speaking of keeping things from crumbling down, let's shift our gaze to the artisans and craftsmen of ancient Egypt, the original creatives who turned the pharaohs' grand visions into reality. These were the folks who made sure the pyramids didn't look like a toddler's sandcastle after a particularly aggressive tide. Forget about clay tablets and papyrus for a moment. We're talking about chisels, hammers, and a whole lot of sweat equity. Artisans in ancient Egypt were like the rock stars of their time, minus the groupies and the leather pants. They were responsible for the intricate carvings, stunning sculptures, and those oh-so-iconic hieroglyphs that turned stone walls into storybooks. The artisans were organized into workshops, often attached to temples or royal projects, and these were buzzing hives of creativity and craftsmanship. Picture a bustling studio, but instead of latte-sipping designers, you've got bare-chested workers and the ever-present dust of sandstone. These workshops weren't just creative spaces, they were also the backbone of a surprisingly complex economy. You see, pharaohs needed artists to immortalize their achievements, and the artisans needed pharaohs who paid in more than just eternal glory. It was a symbiotic relationship, much like the one between a modern artist and their wealthy patrons. The difference, these patrons were building legacies that had to last thousands of years, not just until the next gallery opening. In terms of hierarchy, artisans were somewhere in the middle of the societal pyramid, comfortably above farmers but still below the scribes and priests. They were skilled professionals, and their work was highly valued, but let's not sugarcoat it. Life wasn't all sunshine and papyrus scrolls. Artisans often lived in purpose-built villages, like the famous Deir el-Medina, where they toiled away under the watchful eyes of supervisors who ensured that everyone was pulling their weight. Think of it as an ancient coworking space, but with less Wi-Fi and more mandatory labor quotas. Despite the hardships, being an artisan came with perks. For one, these craftsmen were generally well compensated. They received allotments of grain, beer, and other essentials, ensuring they wouldn't go hungry while chiseling out the next great masterpiece. And let's not forget the beer. Yes, again with the beer. Egyptians consumed it like modern folks drink coffee. It was a dietary staple and a much-needed morale booster after a long day of back-breaking work. Now, let's debunk a myth that's been floating around since who knows when. No, the pyramids were not built by aliens or enslaved masses. Instead, they were the result of meticulous planning and monumental effort. Quite literally, the laborers who constructed these wonders were skilled workers who took pride in their craft. They worked in shifts, much like modern construction crews, rotating between labor and rest to keep the momentum going. And they were organized. Oh, were they organized. The logistics of feeding, housing, and managing thousands of workers would make even the most seasoned project manager break a sweat. The construction of pyramids like the Great Pyramid of Giza, commissioned by Pharaoh Khufu around 2580 BC, was nothing short of a marvel. It took approximately 20 years and some 3 million limestone blocks, each weighing between 5 and 15 tons, to complete. These blocks were hauled across the desert with wooden sledges and ramps, a feat of engineering that didn't require any extraterrestrial intervention, just a lot of human ingenuity and elbow grease. But let's dive into the realm of guilds, those ancient trade unions that banded artisans together. These guilds were more than just professional circles. They were lifelines. They provided training, ensured job security, and sometimes even offered a primitive form of health insurance. And while you won't find any ancient Egyptian guilds striking for better working conditions, they did wield a certain level of influence. After all, without skilled artisans, those colossal statues and intricate tombs would remain mere figments of a pharaoh's imagination. The economic landscape that supported these artisans was as complex as the hieroglyphs they carved. Temples and royal projects were the major employers, and the state played a critical role in managing resources. The economy was largely redistributive, meaning that the state collected taxes, mostly in the form of goods, and then redistributed them as wages. While this might sound like a socialist's dream, it was more about control than equality. The pharaohs and their administrators were the ultimate gatekeepers, deciding who got what and when. In this context, artisans were both beneficiaries and victims of the system. Their skills ensured steady employment, but the rigid structure meant limited upward mobility. It was the kind of economic security that came with invisible chains, safe, but not necessarily empowering. And yet, the artisans' work endured, their legacy carved into stone for millennia to come. They were the unsung heroes of Egypt's golden age, crafting the visual language of one of history's most iconic civilizations. So, the next time you gaze upon an ancient Egyptian sculpture, or marvel at the grandeur of a temple, remember the artisans who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They might not have been the ones sitting on gilded thrones or whispering to the gods, but their hands shaped the very world that those kings and deities inhabited. It's a reminder that while the pharaohs might have been the stars of the show, it was the artisans who built the stage, and what a stage it was. As we continue to unravel the tapestry of ancient Egypt, these craftsmen remain a testament to the enduring power of human creativity, a legacy etched in stone and sand, standing the test of time like the pyramids themselves. Now, let's swap those chisels for plows and take a stroll down to the fertile fields of ancient Egypt, where the real backbone of this civilization, the farmers and laborers, toiled under the relentless sun. These were the folks who truly kept the wheels of Egypt turning. Without them, those grand pyramids and temples would be little more than empty dreams. Picture the scene, an endless expanse of green stretching out along the banks of the ever-faithful Nile, the river that was both a blessing and a taskmaster. You see, for the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was more than just a river. It was the lifeblood of their society. Its annual flooding, known as the inundation, was as predictable as a sunrise, and it brought with it a fresh layer of nutrient-rich silt that transformed the arid desert into lush farmland. This was Egypt's agricultural engine, and without it, the pharaohs might have been stuck eating sand sandwiches. Each year, the floodwaters would rise between June and September, peaking around August. Imagine a natural irrigation system so precise it could make modern farmers weep with envy. But let's not get too misty-eyed here. While the inundation was a miracle of nature, it was also a logistical nightmare. The flooding required careful management, with farmers tasked with rebuilding dikes and canals to channel the water effectively. Talk about teamwork. These efforts were coordinated on a grand scale, often orchestrated by local officials to ensure that every inch of arable land was put to good use. Now, you might think that with Mother Nature doing most of the heavy lifting, farming would be a breeze. But this was ancient Egypt, not a pastoral paradise. The farmers' lives were a perpetual race against time, dictated by the whims of the Nile. Once the waters receded, the clock started ticking. Farmers had to till sow and harvest their crops, primarily emmer wheat and barley, before the next inundation, and they were nothing if not efficient. In a good year, they could produce 2 or even 3 harvests, turning grains into bread and beer, the latter being the fuel that kept this civilization going. Of course, it wasn't all beer and skittles. Taxes were as certain as the sunrise, and the pharaohs were relentless in their demands. Around 10% of the harvest was taken as tribute, a levy that ensured the granaries remained stuffed and the royal coffers jingled. For the farmers, this meant a constant balancing act, how to pay their dues and still have enough left to feed their families. In lean years, when the floods were less generous, this could spell disaster. Famines were a grim reality, leaving many hungry and desperate. And speaking of grim realities, let's talk about the farmer's daily grind. This was a world without tractors or combines, where every task was done by hand, or more accurately, by back-breaking labor. Plows were typically pulled by oxen, but if you couldn't afford livestock, well, you became the ox. The farming tools were rudimentary at best: wooden plows, stone sickles, and a whole lot of elbow grease. It was exhausting work, but the farmers persevered, driven by necessity and the knowledge that their efforts were the bedrock of Egyptian society. Laborers, too, had their fair share of toil. When they weren't working the fields, they were often conscripted into state projects, building temples, pyramids, and other monumental structures. These were not slaves, but conscripted workers, often paid in rations. It was a quid pro quo that ensured the state had the manpower it needed without emptying its coffers. The laborers lived in worker villages like Deir el-Medina, where they enjoyed a sense of community despite the harsh conditions. These villages were the ancient equivalent of company towns, complete with rudimentary housing, communal kitchens, and a strong sense of camaraderie. And let's not forget the women of ancient Egypt, who were the unsung heroines of the agricultural world. They worked alongside men in the fields, tended to livestock, and managed the household. Their roles were vital, yet often overlooked, a testament to their resilience and strength. Women in ancient Egypt could own property, run businesses, and even initiate divorce, rights that many of their contemporaries in other cultures could only dream of. It's no wonder they were celebrated in art and literature as symbols of fertility and domestic harmony. Now, you might be wondering, where did the pharaohs fit into all this? They were, after all, the ultimate landowners, with vast estates spread across the kingdom. These lands were farmed by tenant farmers, who worked in exchange for a share of the produce. The pharaoh's estates were the epitome of efficiency, managed by overseers who ensured that every sheaf of wheat and every bushel of barley was accounted for. It's a classic example of trickle-down economics, ancient Egyptian style, where the wealth generated by the farmers supported the lavish lifestyles of the elite. And so, in the grand tapestry of ancient Egypt, the farmers and laborers were the threads that held it all together. They might not have been celebrated in grand monuments or immortalized in stone, but their contributions were the foundation upon which the entire civilization was built. Their resilience in the face of harsh conditions, their ability to adapt to the whims of nature, and their unwavering dedication to their work ensured that the kingdom not only survived but thrived. As we continue our exploration of ancient Egypt, it's worth remembering that the grandeur of this civilization was not solely the result of divine pharaohs or mighty gods. It was the product of countless ordinary people, working tirelessly behind the scenes to make the extraordinary possible. And while their names might not be etched in history, their legacy lives on in the fields and monuments they left behind, a testament to the enduring power of human endeavor. Stay tuned, because next we'll delve deeper into how these farmers and laborers navigated this complex socio-economic landscape, and how their stories intertwine with the rise and fall of the great pharaohs. We're just scratching the surface of this fascinating civilization, so keep those sandals strapped on tight. There's a lot more Nile to wade through. Now, as we wade further down the Nile, let's shift our focus to the edge of the social map, where the social outcasts and foreigners lingered in the shadows of ancient Egyptian society. These were the folks who didn't quite fit into the neat hierarchy that the pharaohs and their scribes so diligently maintained. Picture a society where the top dogs were the A-listers of divine right, and the rest were left to figure out their place in the cosmic order. While pharaohs were busy immortalizing themselves in stone, these outsiders were busy navigating a social maze without a map. First off, let's talk about the social outcasts, those who were often pushed to the fringes of society, not by choice, but by circumstance. Ancient Egypt, for all its grandeur, had its share of societal misfits. These included the unfortunates who were born with disabilities, those who fell into poverty, or anyone who strayed too far from the societal norms. In a civilization as rigid as Egypt, stepping out of line could mean stepping out of the social matrix entirely. One group that often found itself on the outskirts was the lepers. Leprosy, the ancient equivalent of a social death sentence, was a disease that not only ravaged the body, but also isolated its sufferers from the community. Lepers were often banished to live in separate colonies, far from the bustling life of the cities. It's a harsh reminder that while the Egyptians were pioneers in medicine, their understanding of infectious diseases was still in its infancy. Ironically, these outcasts often received basic care and sustenance from temples that acted as early social safety nets, ensuring they wouldn't starve in their isolation, a small mercy in a brutal world. Then there were the foreigners, those who arrived on Egyptian shores either by choice or by force. Egypt's geographic location made it a crossroads of trade, bringing in a steady stream of traders, mercenaries, and captives. These foreigners were a diverse bunch, hailing from places as varied as Libya, Nubia, and the lands of the Hittites. While some came seeking fortune, others were dragged in chains as prisoners of war, a testament to Egypt's relentless military campaigns. The Egyptians, ever the pragmatists, found ways to integrate these outsiders into their society, at least to an extent. Skilled tradesmen and mercenaries could find a place within the military or craft, their talents too valuable to waste. In fact, foreign mercenaries were often employed as elite guards, trusted for their loyalty to their pay rather than any political faction. It was a classic case of money talks, and in a society where power was everything, even pharaohs knew the value of a well-paid sword. Yet, integration had its limits. Egyptians were fiercely protective of their cultural identity. The idea of foreigners rising to positions of real power was as likely as the Nile flowing backwards. They were often kept on the periphery, their contributions acknowledged, but their presence never fully embraced. This reluctance to fully accept outsiders is a theme echoed throughout history and across cultures, a reminder of the age-old tension between maintaining tradition and embracing change. Despite the barriers, some foreigners managed to make significant inroads. Enter the Hyksos, a Semitic people who managed to seize control of Lower Egypt around 1650 B.C. Their rule was a wake-up call for the Egyptians, who realized that their borders were not as impregnable as they had believed. The Hyksos brought with them new technology, including the horse-drawn chariot, which would forever change Egyptian warfare. However, their rule was short-lived, lasting about a century before the native Egyptians reclaimed their land and expelled the Hyksos. The experience left a lasting mark on the Egyptian psyche, reinforcing a deep-seated wariness of foreign influence. But let's not paint the Egyptians as isolationists. They were savvy enough to recognize the benefits of cultural exchange. Trade routes brought not just goods, but ideas and innovations that enriched Egyptian society. The Egyptians were masters at adopting foreign technologies and customs, tweaking them to fit their own needs. This adaptability is one reason their civilization endured for over 3 millennia. They may have been wary of outsiders, but they were never foolish enough to ignore the advantages they offered. Now, as we reflect on the social dynamics of ancient Egypt, it's clear that this was a society of contrasts, a land where pharaohs ruled with divine authority while social outcasts struggled to find their place. A nation that embraced the Nile's gifts yet feared the chaos it could unleash. A civilization that celebrated its cultural purity while quietly absorbing foreign influences. These contradictions are part of what makes ancient Egypt so endlessly fascinating. A civilization that was as complex as the hieroglyphs they carved into stone. Fast forward to today, and you'll find echoes of ancient Egypt in our modern world. The rigid social hierarchies, the struggle of outsiders to find acceptance, the balance between tradition and innovation. These are themes that continue to resonate. We may no longer live under the gaze of pharaohs, but the challenges of navigating societal norms and embracing diversity remain as relevant as ever. As we wrap up our journey through ancient Egypt, let's take a moment to appreciate the legacy of this remarkable civilization. It's a story of power and perseverance, of human ingenuity and resilience. The Egyptians built a world that was both grand and flawed, a testament to the complexity of human societies. Their achievements continue to captivate our imaginations, a reminder that even in the ancient world, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So next time you find yourself marveling at the pyramids or pondering the mysteries of the Sphinx, remember the people who built this incredible world. From the mighty pharaohs to the humble farmers, from the skilled artisans to the social outcasts, they all played a part in the story of ancient Egypt. It's a story that continues to unfold, one stone at a time, inviting us to explore its depths and uncover the secrets of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. Your day kicks off with a lovely wake-up call from the medieval alarm clock, otherwise known as a rooster. Forget any notions of waking up in a cozy castle chamber. Instead, you're in a cramped, muddy camp surrounded by the lovely scent of unwashed bodies and the distant cries of livestock. Welcome to the reality of the medieval battlefield, where the only thing more persistent than the mud is the smell. First off, let's talk about your living conditions. This isn't some quaint village fairy tale. It's more like a pop-up festival without the music or fun. Tents are pitched haphazardly, and if you're lucky, you've got a straw mattress to shield you from the soggy earth. If not, it's you, the ground, and a prayer for dry weather. Now, onto your gear. You've probably heard that medieval knights were decked out in shiny armor, looking like they just stepped out of a fantasy novel. But here's the scoop. That suit of armor is a financial nightmare. Picture this. A full suit, which includes helmet, breastplate, gauntlets, and greaves, could cost you the equivalent of a small fortune, around £40 in the late 14th century, when the average annual income was merely £5. That's like spending your 5 years' worth of salary on a single outfit. And let's not forget the upkeep. Armor needs constant maintenance. If you've got a dent, you can't just buff it out with a bit of elbow grease. No, you need to find a craftsman to fix it, and they don't work for free. Why, you might ask, would anyone put themselves through this? Well, your options were limited. Either you're a noble, bound by the chivalric code and family duty, or you're a foot soldier hoping to earn a bit of land or loot. Noble or not, you're paying your own way. The crown isn't exactly shelling out for your expenses. Oh, and your pay, a pittance. A foot soldier might earn 6 pence a day, while a night nets 2 shillings. Sounds decent until you realize that's barely enough to cover food, let alone armor repairs. Speaking of food, let's dive into the medieval diet. Forget the feasts of roasted boar and endless goblets of wine you've seen in movies. You're dining on hard biscuits, dried peas, and maybe some salted meat if you're lucky. Fresh produce, rare as dragon's teeth. And don't even think about hygiene. The concept of a spa day is about as foreign as the idea of Wi-Fi. Baths are infrequent, and soap is a luxury. Your best bet for staying clean is a dip in a stream, but even that's a gamble with the local livestock sharing the same water. As you chew on your breakfast of hardtack and contemplate your life choices, let's talk geopolitics. The medieval battlefield is a chessboard of power plays. Maybe you're a soldier in the 100 Years' War, which started in 1337 and dragged on until 1453. That's 116 years of conflict, possibly the worst case of a misleading title in history. This is a time when England and France are locked in a seemingly endless struggle for territory and the crown. Kings come and go, but the battlefield remains constant, a grim testament to their ambitions. So, why are you here? It's not just about clashing swords and gallant charges. There's land to be gained, kingdoms to expand. And for you, there's the hope of plunder. The noble propaganda machine paints these battles as a glorious pursuit of honor, but peel back the layers, and it's mostly about power and profit. By now, you're probably thinking the romanticized image of a medieval soldier is starting to look a bit tarnished. And rightly so. The reality is gritty, uncomfortable, and, more often than not, downright brutal. But hey, at least you're not alone in this muddy mess. Comradeship is one of the few comforts you've got, as well as the shared grumbling about the state of affairs. As the morning drags on, you prepare for the day's skirmish. You're already exhausted, but there's no time for modern luxuries like caffeine boosts or energy bars. Just the promise of potential riches and a vague sense of duty to keep you going. Welcome to the medieval battlefield, where the only guarantee is that you'll be grateful for the little things, like a dry pair of socks. As you lace up those soggy boots and prepare to join the ranks, let's talk logistics. Because let's face it, no one ever won a war on an empty stomach, or with a sword, whoops, missing its blade. In medieval warfare, the supply chain was as crucial as the chainmail. Imagine coordinating the movement of tons of supplies without a single spreadsheet or GPS. That's right, armies were essentially moving cities, and keeping them fed and armed was a Herculean task. First off, food. You can't exactly pop into the nearest medieval convenience store for a quick snack. Instead, armies relied on foraging local markets, if they could afford it, or requisitioning supplies, medieval speak for taking what they needed, often without asking. This was a time when a loaf of bread could make or break morale. During the 100 Years' War, England's army had to ship tons of grain across the Channel just to keep their troops from turning into a hangry mob. The logistics of moving that grain, along with barrels of ale, because hydration is key, across hostile territory was no picnic. Then there's the matter of weaponry. Forget airdrops and supply lines secured by satellites. Back then, if you needed more arrows, you either brought them with you or hoped there was a Fletcher nearby. The English longbow, that legendary weapon of yore, was only as good as the arrows supplied. And these bows weren't your standard backyard archery set. They were massive, requiring years of training to master. The arrows, often tipped with steel, were specifically designed to penetrate armor. During the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English archers famously unleashed a hailstorm of arrows, estimated at over 5,000 a minute, which decimated the French cavalry. But to maintain that rate, you needed skilled craftsmen churning out arrows like they were the medieval version of assembly line workers. Speaking of armor, let's dive a little deeper. Chainmail was the Kevlar of its day. A knight's chainmail coif could weigh upwards of 30 pounds. It was effective against slashes, but less so against blunt force trauma. Enter plate armor, which evolved to counter the increasingly powerful crossbows and early firearms. But here's where economics plays a part. Only the wealthiest could afford the full suit. For the average soldier, a padded gambeson and maybe a helmet were the best they could hope for. And let's not even start on the logistics of moving in that gear. Watch any knight try to mount a horse in full armor, and you'll appreciate why battles were often so slow-paced. Now, let's address the myth of the noble knight leading the charge. Hollywood might have you believe every battle commenced with a cavalry charge led by some dashing knight in gleaming armor. In reality, most knights were more concerned with capturing their enemies for ransom than leading a suicidal charge. War was as much about economic gain as it was about military victory. The social hierarchy within these armies was intricate. Knights often had squires, young men training to be knights themselves, who served as assistants and backup in the chaos of battle. Below them were the foot soldiers and archers, who, despite their critical role, were often seen as expendable. Enter the mercenaries, war's equivalent of freelancers. They were the unsung heroes and sometimes villains of medieval warfare. Known for their prowess and willingness to fight for the highest bidder, mercenaries could turn the tides of battle. During the Italian wars, the condottieri, Italian mercenary leaders, became infamous for their tactical brilliance and equally notorious for switching sides if the price was right. They were the entrepreneurs of the battlefield, reminding us that loyalty often had a price tag attached. All this paints a rather gritty picture, doesn't it? Forget the chivalric code. Battlefield reality was a far cry from the romanticized tales of gallant knights. The chaos was palpable, with war cries and the clang of steel creating a symphony of terror. Commands were often shouted over the din, and misunderstandings were common. The infamous Battle of Crecy in 1346 saw the English longbowmen, positioned strategically on a hill, rain arrows down on the French knights, who were bogged down by mud and confusion. It was less about noble charges and more about strategic positioning and sheer luck. And let's not forget disease, the stealthy adversary that didn't care about your armor or your title. Armies were breeding grounds for illnesses, with dysentery, known as the bloody flux, often claiming more lives than swords. During the Siege of Acre in 1191, disease ravaged the Crusader army, highlighting the brutal reality that Mother Nature often had the final say in who emerged victorious. So, as you stand there, ready to march into the fray with your fellow soldiers, remember that this battlefield is a complex tapestry of strategy, survival, and social dynamics. The reality was far more about endurance and grit than the romanticized glory sung by bards. And while the stories of valor and chivalry captivate our imaginations, it's the less glamorous, logistical side that often decided the fate of kingdoms. Keep your wits about you, and perhaps, just perhaps, you'll live to tell your own tale, mud, sweat, and all. As you clutch your weapon and brace yourself for the chaos ahead, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of medieval combat, where the symphony of steel meeting steel is anything but harmonious. Forget about the picturesque duels in movie scenes. This is more like a marsh pit with deadly consequences. The battlefield is a cacophony of clashing metal, terrified horses, and the unmistakable scent of fear. First, let's talk tactics. You might think charging headlong into battle is the way to go, but hold your horses, literally. Medieval warfare wasn't just about brute force. It was a chess game played with real blood and guts. Terrain was the unsung hero, or villain, of many battles. Commanders didn't just choose a battlefield. They curated it, like a general playing a very high-stakes game of Risk. Hills provided archers the high ground, muddy fields could bog down cavalry, forests offered cover for ambushes. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 is a prime example. The Scots, led by Robert the Bruce, used the marshy ground to their advantage, neutralizing the English cavalry's power and securing a legendary victory. Now, onto the roar of the cavalry, which was as much psychological warfare as physical. Imagine the ground trembling under the hooves of hundreds of horses, the sight of knights in armor glinting in the sun. It was designed to rattle the nerves of even the most seasoned foot soldier. But the reality, horses are unpredictable, and knights risked being unseated and trampled in the melee. At the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the Norman cavalry, initially repelled, eventually wore down the Saxon shield wall through sheer persistence and a bit of luck when King Harold got an arrow in the eye. Speaking of arrows, the English longbowmen were the rock stars of their day, but their fame came with an asterisk. Archers needed to be as fit as modern athletes, capable of drawing a bow with a 150-pound pull weight, all while dodging incoming projectiles and listening to shouted commands over the pandemonium. At the Battle of Agincourt, the English archers famously rained down arrows at a rate of up to 12 per minute. turning the battlefield into a pincushion of misery for the French. And now, the real dirty work, hand-to-hand combat. Forget the elegant fencing moves from the Three Musketeers. This was more like a bar fight with medieval hardware. Swords weren't the delicate tools of precision you might imagine. They were heavy, blunt force instruments designed to break bones through armor. The average arming sword weighed about 5 to 3 pounds, but swinging it repeatedly in battle felt like lifting a small anvil. Axes, maces, and war hammers added to the mix, bringing the blunt trauma party to the battlefield. The war hammer, in particular, was the medieval equivalent of a can opener for armor. Siege engines were the heavy artillery of the time, and they were as impressive as they were unwieldy. Trebuchets, those massive slingshots of destruction, could hurl 300-pound projectiles over 300 yards, but they weren't exactly portable. Setting one up was a logistical nightmare, requiring carpenters, engineers, and a small army just to get it operational. And accuracy. Let's just say you hoped the enemy was standing somewhere in the general vicinity of your target. Now, let's chew on the psychological toll of all this. Imagine standing in a field, surrounded by the noise of battle, the screams of the wounded, and the smell of blood and sweat. You're exhausted, terrified, and just trying to survive another minute. Medieval soldiers didn't have the luxury of PTSD diagnoses or therapy sessions. For them, the psychological scars were permanent but unspoken. The high mortality rates were a grim reminder of the stakes. During the Battle of Toten in 1461, part of the Wars of the Roses, an estimated 28,000 men lost their lives in a single day, making it one of the bloodiest battles on English soil. So why endure this hell on earth? The promise of loot and land, perhaps a shot at glory, or simply because the alternative, being labelled a coward and facing social ruin, was worse. Soldiers were often caught between a rock and a hard place, with honor and survival on one side and the brutal reality of combat on the other. The allure of chivalry and heroism was a powerful motivator, but peel back the knight's shining armor, and you'll find a person just hoping to make it back home in one piece. As the battle rages on, you might find yourself questioning the sanity of it all. But in the medieval world, war was as much a part of life as farming or feasting. It was the ultimate test of strategy, strength, and sheer willpower. And while the legends and songs celebrate the valor and victories, it's the foot soldiers, archers, and unsung heroes who bore the brunt of this brutal dance. The battlefield is far from the romanticized paintings of yesteryear. It's a testament to human endurance and the lengths to which people will go, sometimes literally over the bodies of their fellow men, for a cause, a king, or a coin. As you navigate this gritty landscape, remember that every clang of metal and every shouted command is a chapter in the relentless saga of medieval warfare. And while the stories may fade into history, the echoes of those battles still resonate, reminding us of the complex interplay of courage, chaos, and cold, harsh reality. And just like that, the clang of battle gives way to the eerie quiet of the aftermath. The adrenaline fades, leaving behind a grim tableau of broken bodies and shattered armor. Welcome to the medieval battlefield's less glamorous side, the cleanup. If you think the fighting was tough, wait till you see what comes next. Let's start with the casualties, because, let's face it, medieval medicine wasn't exactly the stuff of miracles. Forget antiseptics and advanced surgical techniques. We're talking about a time when leeches and bloodletting were cutting edge. If you were unlucky enough to catch an arrow or a sword slash, the best you could hope for was a clean wound. Anything more complicated, and you were left at the mercy of surgeons, who were often little more than butchers with a sideline in battlefield triage. Take the Battle of Toten, for instance, where an estimated 28,000 men met their end in the frozen fields of Yorkshire. For those who survived but were injured, the options were grim. Amputation was a common solution for infected wounds, carried out with nothing more than a sharp knife and a strong stomach. Anesthetics. Try a swig of ale or a bite on a leather strap. It's no wonder that many soldiers prefer to take their chances with a slow recovery rather than submit to the saw. And let's talk about disease, the silent reaper that often finished off what the enemy started. Battlefield hygiene was a contradiction in terms, with soldiers living in squalor and drinking from contaminated water sources. It's little surprise that more men died from dysentery than from the enemy's sword. The siege of Acre during the Third Crusade was a prime example. Disease tore through ranks, leaving more casualties than the siege itself. Now, let's pivot to the economic fallout of a single day's battle. Imagine you're a local farmer, just trying to eke out a living when an army rolls through. Fields trampled, livestock requisitioned, barns turned into makeshift barracks. The economic impact was devastating. Agriculture, the backbone of medieval economies, could be set back years by a single skirmish. And the peasants, they were left to pick up the pieces, often conscripted into service or forced to flee their homes. Victory or defeat on the battlefield wasn't just about who held the ground at the end of the day. It could shift the balance of power across entire regions. A win might mean new territories, more resources, and a boost in prestige. A loss could spell disaster, with lands lost and alliances shattered. Take the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where Henry V's unlikely victory over the French not only secured him the title of warrior king, but also shifted the power dynamics of the 100 Years' War. Alliances were as fickle as the weather, with victories paving the way for new political marriages and treaties. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, following Agincourt, saw Henry V recognized as the heir to the French throne, a monumental political shift. But these treaties, like medieval marriages, were often short-lived. The death of Henry V in 1422 threw the English into disarray, illustrating the precarious nature of power built on the battlefield. And then there were the civilians, the overlooked casualties of war. For them, the aftermath wasn't about glory or honor. It was about survival. Primary accounts tell us of towns pillaged, families displaced, and the constant threat of violence. Chroniclers of the time, like Jean Froissart, painted vivid pictures of the chaos left in the wake of armies. His accounts of the 100 Years' War detail not just the grand battles, but also the suffering of ordinary people caught in the crossfire. The ripple effect on local economies was profound. Trade routes disrupted, markets destroyed, and a labor force decimated by conscription or casualties. In cities like Rouen, besieged during the 1418 campaign, the economic impact was catastrophic. Cut off from supplies, the city's population starved, leading to desperate measures. Mothers reportedly threw their children over the walls, hoping the English would show mercy. Spoiler, they didn't. With war came taxes. Funding an army wasn't cheap, and the burden often fell on the peasantry. The 100 Years' War saw both England and France imposing heavy taxes to fund their campaigns, leading to unrest and rebellion. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 was fueled in part by the financial strain of funding foreign wars. The common folk, already scraping by, were pushed to the brink. The romantic notion of knights in shining armor fades when you consider the real cost of war, not just in lives lost, but in livelihoods destroyed. The stories of valor and victory are shadowed by tales of hardship and struggle. For every noble knight returning with tales of glory, there were countless others, nameless and forgotten, who bore the true cost of conflict. As the sun sets on the battlefield, the victors may celebrate, but the land and its people are left to bear the scars. The aftermath of battle is a testament to the harsh realities of medieval warfare. It's a reminder that while kings and knights played their games of power, it was the common folk who paid the price. So, as you ponder the romanticized tales of chivalry and honor, remember the untold stories of those who lived and died in the shadow of battle. The echoes of their struggles still resonate, a stark reminder of the true cost of war. And so, as the dust settles on our medieval battlefield, let's pivot to how this bloody tapestry has woven itself into the fabric of modern-day heroism and valor. It's fair to say that the medieval battlefield has left a legacy more enduring than the stone castles of yore, even if those castles now host more tourists than troops. Our collective imagination is littered with images of gallant knights and noble quests, much like a teenager's bedroom wall plastered with posters of superheroes. Yet, the reality, as we've seen, was more like a gritty indie film than a Hollywood blockbuster. First off, let's talk about the myth of the chivalric knight, that paragon of virtue and bravery. Modern media loves to glamorize these figures, draping them in a cloak of honor and righteousness that rivals the latest superhero flicks. But here's the rub. While some knights indeed adhered to a code of conduct, many were more concerned with their own agendas. They were the medieval equivalent of corporate executives, maneuvering through a cutthroat world of power plays and personal gain. The chivalric code, often romanticized, was more of an ideal than a reality. Think of it as the medieval version of a corporate mission statement, nice on paper, but not always reflected in practice. Consider the legendary William Marshall, often cited as the epitome of chivalry. Marshall served 4 English kings, fought over 500 battles, and was said to embody knightly virtues. Yet, even he was not immune to the harsh realities of the day. His loyalty was as much about survival and opportunity as it was about honor. His story, while remarkable, is a reminder that true chivalry was often a luxury few could afford. Now, onto the romanticized image of the battlefield itself, frequently depicted as a stage for grand duels and valiant charges. This, my friends, is where Hollywood truly spins its yarns. In reality, battles were chaotic, muddy affairs with less scripted drama and more unscripted mayhem. Picture the Battle of Agincourt, where the English longbowmen, knee-deep in muck, turned the tide not with noble charges, but with sheer practicality and strategic positioning. The legend of St. Crispin's Day speech, immortalized by Shakespeare, adds a sheen of glory to what was, in essence, a desperate and bloody slog. The cultural impact of these myths, however, is undeniable. They've shaped our understanding of heroism, turning medieval warriors into larger-than-life figures. Modern military honors, from medals to parades, echo the medieval tradition of celebrating martial prowess. Yet, while the tales inspire, they also obscure the harsh truths beneath the armor. The valor celebrated in legends often glosses over the gritty reality of survival, where cunning and luck were as vital as courage. And then there's the enduring fascination with medieval weaponry, from the iconic longbow to the fearsome broadsword. These instruments of war are often romanticized as the tools of heroes, yet their true story is one of innovation born from necessity. The English longbow, for instance, revolutionized warfare with its range and power, but mastering it required years of training and a physique like a medieval Schwarzenegger. The broadsword, meanwhile, was more utilitarian tool than elegant weapon, designed to cleave through armor with brute force. While they make for impressive museum exhibits and movie props, these weapons were first and foremost tools of survival in a brutal age. So, why does the romantic allure of medieval warfare persist? Perhaps it's the timeless appeal of the underdog story, the knight in shining armor who stands against overwhelming odds. Or maybe it's the human penchant for nostalgia, a longing for a simpler time when valor was as straightforward as charging into battle. Yet, peel back the layers, and you find the reality. A world where survival often trumped honor, and where the heroes of song and story were more complex and flawed than we like to admit. Despite the allure, surviving a medieval battlefield was an ordeal few modern folk could endure. Picture yourself, accustomed to modern conveniences, thrust into this world of mud and mayhem. The physical demands alone, lugging around armor, wielding heavy weapons, enduring harsh conditions, would test even the fittest among us. And let's not forget the psychological toll. The constant presence of death and disease, the lack of medical care, the sheer brutality of combat, all would be enough to send most of us running for the hills, or at least the nearest Wi-Fi signal. In wrapping up our journey through the mire and myth of the medieval battlefield, let's take a moment to appreciate the harsh lessons learned. We've seen the gritty reality behind the romantic veneer, the economic and social forces that shaped these conflicts, and the enduring cultural legacy they've left behind. The next time you find yourself swept up in the tales of gallant knights and heroic battles, remember the untold stories of those who fought, suffered, and endured. For while the legends inspire, it is the reality that truly fascinates and educates. So, as you tuck yourself into your comfy, mud-free bed tonight, ponder this. The next time you watch a medieval epic, remember that the true heroes were not just the knights in shining armor, but also the foot soldiers, the archers, and the unsung heroes who bore the brunt of history's harsh lessons. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'll find a new appreciation for the comforts of modern life, where the closest you'll come to a battlefield is the occasional office skirmish or a particularly intense game of laser tag. And with that, dear listener, we conclude our journey. Thank you for joining me on this plunge into the past. May you sleep soundly, dreaming of dragons, knights, and perhaps just a little less mud. In the swirling chaos of ancient Rome, your average tax collector wasn't just a paper pusher. He was a gladiator in the arena of finance. Forget the image of a mild-mannered accountant hunched over a ledger. Roman tax collection was more like the Wild West, complete with its own band of tax cowboys known as the Publicani. These were private contractors, but don't let the innocuous title fool you. They operated more like cunning entrepreneurs, and their methods could make your skin crawl faster than a chariot race. Let's start with some foundational trivia. You might think taxes are a modern headache, but Rome was dishing out tax bills long before the IRS was a twinkle in anyone's eye. The Romans devised taxes like the tributum, a direct tax on property, and the portorium, a customs duty on imports and exports. These were the financial lifeblood of the empire, fueling Rome's insatiable appetite for conquest and expansion. Picture Julius Caesar flexing his military muscles. Every legion marching forward needed to be paid, fed, and equipped. Those shiny helmets didn't come cheap, and neither did the soldiers beneath them. Now, you're probably wondering how this all played out. Rome didn't exactly have a centralized tax office with a hotline you could call to dispute charges. Instead, they outsourced the dirty work to the Publicani, who were essentially the original tax farmers. These guys bid for the rights to collect taxes in a specific region, a bit like modern companies vying for a lucrative government contract. They paid the state a fixed sum up front, then squeezed the populace to make a profit. Talk about high risk, high reward. It was a cutthroat business where only the shrewdest survived, and the margins were as sharp as a gladiator's sword. The Publicani weren't just numbers people. They were master manipulators of the system. They'd use every trick in the scrolls to maximize their collections. Sometimes this meant leaning on the local population with persuasive charm, but more often than not, it involved a little arm twisting, metaphorically and literally. Think of them as the original debt collectors with a Roman twist. They'd stop at nothing to ensure every last denarius was accounted for, whether it meant seizing assets or imposing crippling fines. Now, let's bust a myth or two. You might have heard tales of tax collectors living like kings off the spoils of their labors. While it's true that some Publicani amassed great wealth, enough to make Jeff Bezos blush, they weren't universally loved. In fact, they were about as popular as a toga malfunction at a Senate meeting. Many Romans viewed them with suspicion and disdain. There's even an old Roman phrase, pecunia non alit, meaning money doesn't stink, which supposedly originated when Emperor Vespasian imposed a tax on public urinals. It was his way of reminding everyone that profit is profit, no matter how unsavory the source. The role of the Publicani was crucial in maintaining Rome's empire, but it came at a social cost. Tax collectors were seen as necessary evils, the embodiment of Rome's relentless need for resources. Their presence was a constant reminder of the state's power and reach, stretching from the British Isles to the sands of Egypt. They were the gears in the grand machine of Roman bureaucracy, grinding away to keep the empire's coffers full. Speaking of coffers, let's dig into some numbers. During the early days of the Republic, the tributum was relatively modest. It was a direct tax levied on citizens during times of war, calculated based on property value. However, as Rome's territories expanded, so did its financial demands. By the time of the empire, the tributum had evolved into a more complex system, encompassing a wide array of taxes that funded everything from military campaigns to public works. The portorium, on the other hand, was a customs duty collected at various points of trade. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a toll booth, but with more Roman flair. The Publicani were the middlemen in this intricate dance of coins and contracts. They were responsible for ensuring that the state received its due, but they also had to turn a profit. It was a balancing act worthy of a circus performer, and they often walked a tightrope of legality and morality. Some took their role to extremes, exploiting loopholes and bending rules to maximize their take. Others faced the wrath of the populace, who saw them as little more than sanctioned extortionists. Now, before you get too caught up in the romance of rebel taxmen, remember that the Publicani were no Robin Hoods. They didn't rob from the rich to give to the poor. They took from everyone to line their own pockets. Their methods were often brutal, and their reputation for ruthlessness was well earned. Yet, despite their infamy, they were an integral part of Roman society. Without them, the empire's grand ambitions might have crumbled like a poorly baked loaf of Roman bread. To truly grasp the scale of their operation, consider this. During the height of the Roman Empire, it's estimated that taxes constituted up to 10% of a citizen's income. In some provinces, it could be even higher, especially if local governors decided to impose additional levies. It was a complex web of taxation that required both finesse and force to navigate, and the publicani were the spiders sitting at the center. So, as you stroll through the bustling streets of ancient Rome, take a moment to appreciate the invisible hand of the publicani at work. They might not have been the heroes of their time, but they were the unsung architects of an empire. Without their relentless pursuit of revenue, the grandeur of Rome might never have reached such dizzying heights. And the next time you grumble about taxes, spare a thought for those who face the wrath of the publicani. Your tax return might seem like a pain, but at least modern tax collectors won't show up at your door demanding payment in chickens. As the dust settles from the last chariot race of Roman tax collection, let's take a stroll through those sun-drenched provinces where the publicani worked their magic, or rather, their menace. Picture it, the Roman Empire sprawling like a colossal marble behemoth, stretching from the rugged cliffs of Britannia to the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, each province a cog in this vast imperial machine. But behind the grandeur and glory was a system as ruthless as a lion in the gladiatorial arena. Enter the tax collectors, armed not with swords but with scrolls and seals, yet no less formidable. These guys weren't just collecting taxes. They were running a full-scale operation, managing logistics that would put a modern supply chain to shame. Their methods of ensuring compliance could make even the most hardened centurion wince. Forget gentle reminders or polite requests. Think more along the lines of public auctions, where your prized possessions could be sold off to the highest bidder if you missed a payment. It was a bit like having your house repossessed after a single missed mortgage payment. And if you thought that was harsh, wait till you hear about the intimidation tactics. The publicani had a knack for making people an offer they couldn't refuse, long before a certain Sicilian family made it famous. Imagine a couple of burly enforcers, perhaps with a touch of garlic on their breath, showing up at your door. They weren't just there to chat about the weather. These were the muscle behind the money, ensuring that the state's coffers stayed full and their own pockets lined. It was a prime example of the carrot and stick approach. Only they seem to have misplaced the carrot. Now, let's talk about the censor and quaestor, the unsung heroes and villains of this tax drama. The censor was like the ultimate auditor, responsible for maintaining the census and overseeing public morals. His role in tax collection was crucial, as he determined the value of properties, and by extension, the amount each citizen was expected to cough up. This was no small task, considering a census could take up to 18 months to complete. And let's face it, trying to get accurate information from a populace with a penchant for evasion was like trying to herd cats. On the other side, we had the quaestor, a junior officer in the financial hierarchy. If the censor was the brains, the quaestor was the brawn, handling the actual collection and management of funds. These were the guys who ensured that the publicani didn't get too greedy, a thankless task akin to telling a lion to stick to salad. Their work could make or break a Roman governor's career. After all, nothing derailed a political ambition faster than an empty treasury or a public scandal involving tax mismanagement. The economic context here is as rich as a Roman banquet. The tax system wasn't just about funding the empire's endless military campaigns or building those iconic aqueducts. It was also a tool of control, a way for Rome to assert its dominance over conquered lands. You see, taxes weren't just a financial burden. They were a constant reminder of who was in charge. In provinces like Judea, this control was a powder keg of resentment, helping fuel revolts that would shake the empire's foundations. And speaking of foundations, let's bust some myths. Ever heard the one about Roman roads being built solely for trade and transport? Sure, they were great for moving legions and goods, but they also served a more sinister purpose, facilitating the swift movement of tax collectors and their enforcers. A well-paved road meant you couldn't outrun the taxman, no matter how fleet-footed your horse. It was a clever design, ensuring the empire's grip on its subjects was as firm as a gladiator's handshake. As we journey through these provinces, it's clear that the romantic image of Rome as a beacon of civilization glosses over the harsh realities of its tax machinery. The Publicani, with their blend of cunning and coercion, were the engine driving this empire, their influence felt in every corner of Roman life. From the bustling markets of Alexandria to the remote outposts of Gaul, their reach was as long as a Roman spear. But let's not forget the human element. Amidst the numbers and systems were real people, those who collected the taxes and those who paid them. The former might have enjoyed the thrill of the chase, the latter not so much. Yet in a way, they were all players in the same game, caught in the relentless cycle of imperial ambition and expansion. So next time you feel the pinch of a tax bill, spare a thought for those who came before. Sure, your tax return might feel like a Herculean task, but at least you don't have a pair of Roman enforcers breathing down your neck. As we continue this journey through the Roman tax system, remember that behind every grand empire lies a less glamorous reality, a world of ledgers and liabilities, of power plays and politics, and the story isn't over yet. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into this ancient world, uncovering more tales of fiscal fortitude and financial folly. As we continue our jaunt through the Roman tax labyrinth, prepare yourself to see the empire's tax collectors in a slightly different light. Picture a bustling Roman market. Citizens scurry around like ants, each with their own burdens, but one weight they all share is the taxman's shadow. It looms large, casting a pall over the everyday transactions. For the average Roman citizen, paying taxes wasn't just an annual inconvenience. It was a relentless burden that could tip them from stability into ruin faster than you can say, Carthago delenda est. Let's get real about the socio-economic ripple effect here. For many Roman citizens, taxes weren't just a line item in the budget. They were a full-blown financial Achilles heel. Consider this. The tributum tax, a cornerstone of the Roman fiscal system, was pegged to property value. Fine if you're rolling in villas like a Roman real estate mogul, but not so great if your property is more modest. And the portorium, that pesky customs tax, meant that even the humble merchant was constantly calculating tariffs every time a shipment came in from Alexandria or beyond. Now, you might think that being squeezed by the Publicani would unite the Roman populace in a chorus of down with taxes. But in reality, it was more like a cacophony of individual protests. Each citizen was left grappling with their own financial woes, which meant solidarity was about as common as snow in the Sahara. However, when taxes were pushed too far, public unrest was never far behind. And when the citizens did finally rally, the Publicani often found themselves at the sharp end of the stick, literally. Enter the voices of dissent, and none more eloquent than Cicero, ever the orator. He wasn't shy about critiquing the system. He famously lamented the Publicani's greed, describing them as those who plunder all lands and seas, to whom the very sun never sets, as they pursue their greed. His words struck a chord, because they articulated a growing frustration with the Publicani's excesses that could be felt across the empire. Pliny, the younger, chimed in too, often chronicling the economic strain on provincial towns in his letters. He painted a picture of communities burdened by taxes, their prosperity drained to fill Rome's insatiable coffers. So, what happened when the burden became too great? Well, sometimes it led to full-blown rebellion. The most infamous of these flare-ups was the revolt in Judea. The boiling point was reached when Gessius Florus, a particularly heavy-handed procurator, decided to seize the temple treasury in Jerusalem, claiming unpaid taxes. Predictably, this didn't go down well. His actions ignited the First Jewish-Roman War, 66-73 CE, a conflict that would shake the empire to its core, a stark reminder of the fine line between taxation and tyranny. Speaking of fine lines, let's take a moment to debunk the myth of the all-powerful Publicani. Sure, they wielded a certain power, but they were also at the mercy of the system they served. Rome's political elite were no fools. They knew that unchecked power could breed corruption. The Publicani had to navigate a tightrope, balancing their own ambitions with the ever-watchful eye of the Senate. If a tax collector got too greedy and sparked a riot, you could bet their cushy contract would be reviewed faster than you can say Cicero's speeches. And let's not forget the economic context that framed this drama. At the empire's height, taxes were a vital tool of imperial control, a way to keep conquered lands under Rome's thumb. But they were also a mirror reflecting the empire's priorities. In times of war, taxes could spike, funding Caesar's latest campaign or Augustus's grandiose urban renewal projects. In times of peace, they might ease slightly, a carrot to the citizenry's weary donkey. Yet, the grandeur of Rome was built on a paradox. The very taxes that funded its expansion also threatened its stability. It was a powder keg, and the publicani were the ones lighting matches all around it. Their role was crucial, but it was also contentious, a necessary evil in the grand tapestry of Roman bureaucracy. As we delve deeper into this ancient tax saga, keep an eye on the human element, real people caught in the empire's fiscal web. Tax collectors were the empire's front line, both admired and reviled, their actions a testament to Rome's reach and ambition. But they were also a reminder of the empire's fragility, a system that could crack under the weight of its own demands. So, the next time you grumble about taxes, remember those Roman citizens who felt the full brunt of the publicani's demands. At least today, you won't find your property auctioned off at the drop of a denarius, or your local temple treasury pilfered in the name of tax collection. But the story's not over yet. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the intricate dance of Roman tax collection, where history meets humanity and the past is anything but a foreign country. Now, let's pivot from the Roman tax grindstone to one of its most infamous practitioners, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Picture him as the Jeff Bezos of his day, but with a bit more toga and a lot more blood on his hands. Crassus wasn't just any Roman mogul. He was a powerhouse of wealth and ambition, straddling the line between savvy businessman and ruthless opportunist with the grace of a lion eyeing its prey. Crassus's fortune was the stuff of legend. At one point, his wealth was estimated at 200 million sestertii. That's enough cash to buy a small Roman army or two, with leftovers for a lavish banquet that would make Nero blush. But how did he amass such an ungodly sum? Well, it wasn't by pinching pennies or clipping coupons. One of Crassus's more ingenious, if morally questionable, methods involved real estate. When Rome was set ablaze by one of its many fires, because what's a Roman neighborhood without a little pyrotechnic flair? Crassus would swoop in like a vulture over carrion. He had a private fire brigade, but their hoses stayed dry until desperate property owners sold their charred remains at rock-bottom prices. It was a classic case of disaster capitalism, Roman style. Now, you might ask, was Crassus a pioneer of urban renewal or just a glorified arsonist with a flair for real estate? The truth is a bit of both. While he certainly capitalized on Rome's misfortunes, he wasn't setting the fires himself, at least not that we know of. But his aggressive tactics did earn him a reputation as a man who wouldn't let a good crisis go to waste. Crassus didn't stop at property. He also dabbled in the art of tax collection, buying up tax contracts for entire provinces. This was a risky venture, akin to buying stocks in a volatile market, but Crassus had the tenacity and the muscle to squeeze every last sestertius out of the locals. His network of agents acted like Roman loan sharks, ensuring compliance through a mix of intimidation and financial acumen. If there was a denarius to be collected, you can bet Crassus had his thumb firmly on the scales. But Crassus's dealings weren't just about amassing wealth. They were a strategic maneuver in the cutthroat world of Roman politics. Money was power, and Crassus wielded it like a gladiator brandishing a sword. His financial clout helped him secure key political alliances, most famously with Julius Caesar and Pompey in the First Triumvirate. This triumvirate wasn't just a power block. It was a masterclass in political chess, where each member used their unique strengths to outmaneuver the Senate and consolidate control. Speaking of the Senate, let's not forget how tax policies could become weapons in political rivalries. The Senate was the ultimate arena, where the stakes were nothing less than the control of Rome itself. Political enemies would use tax audits as a form of warfare, targeting rivals with accusations of mismanagement or corruption. It was a game of fiscal brinksmanship, where a well-timed scandal could topple even the mightiest of Rome's elite. Take, for example, the case of Caro the Younger, a staunch opponent of Caesar. Caro's rigid moral code and insistence on accountability made him a thorn in the side of Rome's more unscrupulous politicians. When Caesar proposed a law to relieve tax farmers of a portion of their debts, Caro saw it as a blatant attempt to curry favor with the publicani and opposed it vehemently. The ensuing clash was more than just a debate about tax policy. It was a battle for the soul of the Republic, with Caro standing as the last bastion of integrity in a sea of corruption. But let's not put all the blame on the Romans. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and you'll find that the portrayal of tax collectors has hardly improved. From medieval times to modern tales, taxmen have been cast as villains. Think of the sheriff of Nottingham, always with his hand in the common man's pocket. Yet, in reality, many were just bureaucrats doing a thankless job, caught between the demands of their rulers and the ire of the taxed. Even today, we can't help but view tax collectors through a lens of skepticism. They're the necessary evil, the ones who keep the wheels of government turning while we grumble about deductions and returns. But maybe, just maybe, there's a lesson to be learned from our ancient counterparts. Behind the numbers and ledgers, there are stories of human ambition and folly, of power plays and political intrigue. As we continue to peel back the layers of Roman tax history, let's remember that these ancient figures weren't just caricatures of greed or virtue. They were complex humans playing a high-stakes game in an unforgiving world. A world where taxes weren't just a fiscal policy, but a statement of power, control, and ambition. Stay tuned, because we're not done unraveling this tale of coin and conquest. The best, or perhaps the most scandalous, is yet to come. Now that we've unraveled the tangled web of Roman tax shenanigans, let's step back and take stock of the long-standing legacy these ancient practices left in their wake. Spoiler alert, the Romans weren't just trendsetters in architecture and military conquests. They were also the OGs of tax systems that would reverberate through the corridors of history. First, let's zoom in on their knack for outsourcing tax collection, a move that would make modern privatization enthusiasts nod with admiration. The Publicani, those crafty tax farmers we've come to know and love, or loathe, pioneered a system that allowed the state to rake in revenue without getting its hands too dirty. This model of subcontracting financial duties wasn't just a Roman quirk. It set a precedent that popped up again in the Middle Ages across Europe and even influenced the development of tax farming in the Ottoman Empire. If you think about it, the concept of outsourcing was Rome's way of saying, why do it yourself when you can get someone else to take the blame? But let's not get too misty-eyed about Roman innovation. Their tax system was also a cautionary tale of what happens when profit motives run amok. The unchecked power of the Publicani, often leading to abuses and corruption, reminds us of the importance of oversight, an idea not lost on the architects of modern tax systems. Today's IRS may seem like a faceless monolith, but it's built on the principle of accountability, a concept the Romans occasionally misplaced in their zeal for revenue. Speaking of accountability, the Romans were master-class teachers in the art of tax as a tool of control and compliance. Their taxes weren't just about filling imperial coffers. They were a constant reminder of Rome's dominion over conquered lands. This wasn't just about money. It was psychological warfare. Fast forward to today, and taxes still serve as a means for governments to exert influence, though perhaps with a bit more finesse and fewer legions. Let's take a detour into the political arena, where the Roman approach to taxes was less about tea parties and more about power plays. The Senate wielded tax audits like a gladiator's sword, using them to cut down political opponents. This blend of fiscal policy and political maneuvering laid the groundwork for future governments, which continue to use tax codes as tools for social engineering and political leverage. Just ask any politician proposing tax cuts or hikes during an election year. It's not just about economics, it's about winning hearts and votes. Now, as we wrap up our Roman tax saga, let's indulge in a little time travel. Imagine a Roman tax collector, toga and all, plopped into a modern IRS office. The poor guy would probably be baffled by the lack of scrolls and the strange glow of computer screens. Where are the Publicani? He'd ask, searching for those familiar entrepreneurial enforcers. Instead, he'd find a sea of cubicles filled with agents quietly tapping away at keyboards. No muscle-bound enforcers in sight, just a lot of paperwork and perhaps a pot of questionable coffee. A Roman friend might be relieved to find that today's tax system doesn't involve public auctions of your belongings or a couple of burly enforcers at your door. But he'd likely be astounded by the complexity of modern tax laws, with their deductions, credits, and loopholes that would even make a wily publicanus scratch his head. And while he might chuckle at the thought of taxes funding things like public schools and healthcare, instead of just military conquests, he'd nod in recognition at the familiar themes of revenue and control. In the end, the legacy of Roman tax practices is a mixed bag of innovation, exploitation, and enduring influence. They were both architects and cautionary tales, showing us the potential and pitfalls of taxes as tools of empire. While the players have changed, trading togas for ties, the game remains surprisingly familiar. Taxes are still the lifeblood of governments, fueling both their ambitions and their obligations to the people. So, as you finish this little odyssey, spare a thought for those ancient publicani, the censors, and even the beleaguered taxpayers. They've left us a legacy that's as enduring as the Roman roads and as complex as a Caesar's political strategy. And next time tax season rolls around, remember, at least you're not paying in chickens. As you crack open your eyelids to the sound of distant coughing in a Victorian sanatorium, you might be questioning the life choices, or unfortunate circumstances, that landed you here. Welcome to a place where the medical practices are as questionable as the fashion choices, and the morning routine is about as comforting as a cold cup of tea. First, let's clear something up. This isn't some cozy retreat for a spa weekend. No, you're in a 19th century institution where the line between patient care and medieval torture can get a bit blurry. The day kicks off with a tonic that's supposed to set you right, but instead, it's more like a cocktail of mercury and other chemicals that would make a modern-day pharmacist break into a cold sweat. The morning dose of mercury, by the way, isn't just for flavor. It's believed to purify your blood. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Mercury poisoning. Anyone. But hey, doctors at the time were convinced they were onto something big. It's a bit like self-help gurus today, except instead of kale smoothies, you've got liquid metal. You then get the pleasure of meeting the resident leeches. Yep, those slimy little suckers are here to balance your humors, which sounds far more whimsical than it is. The Victorians believed that an imbalance of bodily fluids was the root of all ailments. So, naturally, attaching a handful of hungry leeches to your skin was the logical solution. It was either that or a good old-fashioned bloodletting session, but more on that delightful practice later. Now, you might be thinking, why would anyone pay good money for this? Great question. The answer lies in the economics of Victorian healthcare, which were as murky as a London fog. This wasn't just about health, it was a status symbol. If you could afford to be here, you were doing all right. It was about as costly as a small fortune, comparable to spending tens of thousands of today's dollars on a wellness retreat that promises eternal youth, but delivers mild anemia instead. Doctors at these places weren't just healers, they were entrepreneurs. They knew how to market these bizarre treatments as cutting-edge science. The Victorians were obsessed with progress, and they were willing to shell out big bucks for anything that promised a modern miracle. It's like the 1800s version of buying the latest iPhone because it has one more pixel than the last one. And just like that iPhone, you don't really need it, but it sure feels good to say you have it. Aside from the personal prestige of being treated in such a place, there was a social benefit, too. The upper crust loved to flaunt their sanatorium, stays the way some people today boast about their gluten-free diets. It was a conversation starter at dinner parties, a way to demonstrate that you were both wealthy and health-conscious. Forget about the fact that these treatments were about as effective as using a chocolate teapot. But let's not be too harsh on our Victorian friends. They were working with the best knowledge they had, even if that knowledge seems laughable now. They didn't have access to modern medical advancements, and the understanding of disease was, let's just say, in its infancy. The germ theory was still a radical idea, so the best they could do was juggle mercury and leeches like a circus act. As the morning drags on, you're shuffled from one treatment to another, each one more perplexing than the last. You might find yourself in a galvanic bath next, where electric currents are sent through your body in the hope of jolting you back to health. It's like a primitive version of electroshock therapy, minus the understanding of brain chemistry. The idea was to stimulate the body's vital energy, a concept that's as scientifically sound as believing the earth is flat. Throughout the day, you're surrounded by fellow patients who are just as bewildered as you are. There's a camaraderie in shared suffering, a nod to the absurdity of it all. And while there's a certain romance to the idea of these grand old buildings and their storied pasts, the the reality is much less charming. The walls may be adorned with elegant woodwork, but the air is heavy with the scent of desperation and questionable hygiene. So, as you sit there, possibly with a few leeches still clinging on for dear life, you start to understand why these places were more about appearances than actual healing. The Victorian Sanatorium was less a hospital and more a theatre of the bizarre, where doctors played the part of mad scientists, and patients were both the audience and the unwitting participants in a grand experiment. It's a testament to human resilience and gullibility that these places thrived as long as they did. With the morning rituals almost complete, you're left with a lot to ponder. Namely, how anyone survived this era at all. But as you'll come to see, this is just the beginning of a day that promises to challenge your understanding of what healthcare could and should be. Stay tuned, because the afternoon holds even more Victorian surprises that will make you grateful for modern medicine, misguided as it sometimes can be. And just when you think your day couldn't get any more bewildering, it's time to face the formidable challenge of a Victorian breakfast. Settle in, because we're about to dive headfirst into a world where personal hygiene, or the glaring absence of it, competes with your gag reflex for supremacy. First, let's tackle this breakfast business. If you've ever complained about your cereal being a bit soggy, prepare to eat those words, along with some stale bread and weak tea. The Victorian breakfast table wouldn't win any culinary awards unless they're for creative uses of porridge. It was an era when the line between food and punishment wasn't always clear. You might find some bacon and eggs if you were lucky, but given the state of sanitation, you'd be wise to ask just how recently those eggs got friendly with a chicken. Now, let's talk plumbing, or more accurately, the lack thereof. The average Victorian sanatorium was about as equipped for modern hygiene as a horse-drawn carriage is for a NASCAR race. Indoor plumbing was a luxury, often reserved for the affluent, meaning you might find yourself getting cozy with a chamber pot. Yes, that's a fancy term for a glorified bucket, and if you think that's bad, just wait until you hear about the infamous night soil men who came to collect the contents. These poor souls were the unsung heroes, or perhaps martyrs, of Victorian waste management, carding away humanity's less glamorous outputs under the cover of darkness. So, how did these prim and proper Victorians deal with cleanliness in the face of such primitive facilities? Spoiler alert, they didn't, at least not by today's standards. The myth of the pristine Victorian is just that, a myth. Bathing was more of a biannual affair, often taken in a shared tub, with the water remaining unchanged between users. If you were the last in line, well, you'd be cleaner rolling around in a field. It's enough to make even the most rugged modern camper feel like they're living in the lap of luxury. One might assume that with all this neglect of personal hygiene, the Victorians must have been walking germ factories. And you'd be right. But here's the kicker. They didn't even know it. The germ theory of disease was still in its infancy, a radical concept that many dismissed outright. Instead, they clung to the miasma theory, which blamed diseases on bad air, emanating from decomposing organic matter. So, while they were busy trying to avoid these invisible miasmas, they ignored the very visible dirt and grime clinging to their bodies and surroundings. And speaking of dirt, let's not forget the state of the streets. Picture this. An average day in a Victorian city was like an obstacle course of mud, animal droppings, and goodness knows what else. It was a bit like living in a permanent episode of a survival show, but without the camera crew to bail you out. The well-to-do might have their servants clean the muck off their shoes before entering their homes, but for the average Jane or Joe, it was just another day at the dirt rodeo. Now, let's debunk another myth, the notion that Victorian homes were the epitome of tidiness. Sure, they loved a good doily and polished silverware, but those were often just for show. Beneath the veneer of lace and mahogany, dust bunnies waged wars of attrition, and the air was thick with coal dust from the ever-present fireplaces. The reality was less Downton Abbey and more a lesson in how to artfully arrange clutter to give the illusion of order. If you're starting to feel a bit queasy, you're not alone. It's a wonder anyone survived long enough to enjoy the invention of the flush toilet. And when that marvel of modern engineering finally did come around, it was like the dawn of a new era. By the late 19th century, cities began to install sewer systems and proper sanitation facilities, a turning point that drastically improved public health. But in the meantime, the Victorians made do with what they had, which was mainly a lot of wishful thinking. As you sit contemplating the dubious pleasures of Victorian breakfast and hygiene, you might wonder how they managed to balance their high-minded ideals with such low standards of cleanliness. The answer lies in their obsession with social appearances. To be seen as cultured and sophisticated was paramount, even if it meant turning a blind eye and nose to the less savory aspects of daily life. So there you have it, a morning in the life of a Victorian sanatorium patient, where breakfast is a trial, hygiene is optional, and the only thing more baffling than the medical practices is the state of sanitation. You've survived the morning, congratulations, but don't get too comfortable. The day is young, and the Victorians have plenty more surprises in store. From the eerie halls of the sanatorium to the streets outside, the afternoon promises to be an eye-opening journey through the bizarre world of 19th century healthcare and social customs. Stay tuned, because if you thought the morning was a wild ride, you haven't seen anything yet. And just when you think your day couldn't get any more bewildering, you find yourself thrust into the social labyrinth of a Victorian sanatorium afternoon. If you thought the morning was a test of endurance, wait until you try navigating the peculiar norms and etiquette that were as tightly wound as the corsets you're about to encounter. Ah yes, corsets. The Victorian version of a bear hug, minus the warmth and comfort. These contraptions were the backbone of fashion, quite literally, squeezing the life out of you for the sake of that coveted hourglass figure. Now, don't get me wrong, corsets had their allure. They promised a silhouette that would make even the most stoic onlooker swoon, or at least gasp for breath. But the reality was a bit less glamorous. Wearing a corset was like being in a 24/7 embrace with a boa constrictor. Forget about bending over or taking a deep breath. Every move was a delicate negotiation with the laws of physics and the limits of human anatomy. As you meander through the sanatorium gardens, you might notice the ladies gliding along as if they're on wheels. That's the secret of the corset, giving the illusion of effortless grace while hiding a world of discomfort. And it wasn't just women who fell victim to these fashion faux pas. Men had their own sartorial struggles, stuffed into waistcoats and high collars that made every meal a potential choking hazard. But fashion was just the tip of the iceberg. Victorian social norms were as intricate as a lace doily and just as fragile. Every conversation was a minefield of potential faux pas. You see, the art of small talk wasn't just about filling silence. It was a strategic game of verbal chess. Topics like politics, religion, or anything remotely controversial were off the table. Instead, you'd find yourself discussing the weather or perhaps the latest opera performance, all while maintaining an air of detached sophistication. The pressure to conform to these social niceties wasn't just about fitting in, it was about survival. In a world where reputation was everything, one slip of the tongue could lead to social exile faster than you can say improper conduct. It's no wonder that many Victorians found these gatherings as exhausting as a full day's labor. In fact, the social calendar could rival a modern CEO's schedule for sheer intensity. And then there were the calling cards, the Victorian equivalent of a Facebook poke. Visiting someone's home wasn't just a casual drop-by. It was an orchestrated performance. You'd leave your card with the servant, who would then decide if the master or mistress of the house was at home to receive you. It was a system designed to filter out the riffraff and maintain the delicate balance of social standing. In the wider cultural and political landscape, these social mores weren't just quirks. They were tools of power and control. The rigid etiquette served to reinforce class divisions, ensuring that everyone knew their place in the social hierarchy. It was a world where even a misplaced napkin could speak volumes about one's character and upbringing. But let's not kid ourselves. These rituals had their charm. They offered a sense of order in a world that was rapidly changing. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping society at a breakneck pace, and these time-honored traditions acted as a comforting anchor. It was a way to cling to the familiar while everything else seemed to be hurtling toward modernity. Yet, as alluring as this Victorian veneer might seem, it masked a harsher reality. Beneath the polished surface was a society grappling with profound inequalities. The same rules that dictated social interactions also perpetuated gender and class disparities that were as unyielding as a well-laced corset. Women, in particular, were often relegated to the role of decorative accessories. They're worth measured more by their ability to adhere to societal norms than by any personal achievements. As you sit amidst the garden parties and afternoon teas, it's hard not to marvel at the sheer resilience it took to navigate such a world. The Victorian era was a paradox, a time of great progress and profound conservatism, where innovation danced uncomfortably with tradition. It was an age that managed to be both ahead of its time and stubbornly rooted in the past. So, as the afternoon sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns, you might find yourself pondering the legacy of these bygone days. The Victorian obsession with appearances and etiquette may seem quaint now, but it laid the groundwork for the social dynamics that continue to shape us today. From the boardroom to the ballroom, the echoes of Victorian formality can still be heard, whispering reminders of a time when every gesture and word was freighted with meaning. And as you prepare to face the evening's rituals, you're left with a sense of admiration for those who endured this labyrinthine world. After all, it wasn't just about surviving the sanatorium. It was about navigating the intricate dance of a society that demanded perfection at every turn. But don't get too comfortable. The night promises its own set of challenges as the Victorian theatre of manners and mores continues its relentless march. Stay tuned, because if you think you've seen it all, the evening has yet another act up its well-tailored sleeve. As the evening curtain begins its descent, the Victorian world prepares to swap its day-to-day drudgery for a touch of the dramatic. That's right, folks, it's time to explore the wild world of Victorian entertainment, where the upper classes darn their finest for evenings filled with opium and oddities, and the masses escaped into the lurid pages of penny dreadfuls. It's a landscape as colourful as a Turner painting, and about as stable as a house of cards. Let's kick things off with the upper crust and their flirtation with opium. The Victorians had an affair with this potent narcotic that would make your average soap opera love triangle blush. By the mid-19th century, London alone boasted approximately 60,000 opium users, a hefty number given the city's population hovered around 2.5 million. Opium was as much a part of the social tapestry as afternoon tea, offering a transcendent escape from the era's pressures. Opium dens, shadowy havens tucked away in the city's underbelly, were the golden spots for those seeking a euphoric trip. These establishments, often located in areas like Limehouse, were draped in mystery and allure, promising an exotic experience far removed from polite society. But beneath the allure lay a harsh reality, addiction. While the romanticized vision of the opium den persists, it's important to remember that these places were more about escapism than enlightenment. For the Victorians, opium was a double-edged sword, cutting through the monotony of life while binding users in chains of dependency. Next, let's saunter over to the freak show, another cornerstone of Victorian amusement. These spectacles were the 19th century equivalent of a blockbuster movie or viral cat video, drawing crowds eager to gawk at the other. Figures like Joseph Merrick, the so-called Elephant Man, were showcased as living curiosities, their lives put on display for public consumption. It was a time when human differences were exploited for entertainment, reflecting the era's complex mix of curiosity and cruelty. Freak shows were more than mere entertainment. They were a reflection of the Victorian obsession with categorization and the normal. In an age when Darwin's theories on evolution were shaking the foundations of human understanding, these performances offered a way to reinforce societal norms by highlighting deviations. Yet, for many performers, the freak show circuit was a double-edged sword, providing both livelihood and exploitation. It's a harsh reminder that what fascinates can also dehumanize. While the elite indulged in opium and oddities, the average Victorian turned to the cheap thrills of penny dreadfuls. These serialized stories, costing just a penny, were the Netflix of their day, providing weekly installments of blood, guts, and supernatural intrigue. Titles like Varney the Vampire and Sweeney Todd offered a deliciously dark escape from the drudgery of everyday life. By the 1860, over 1 million copies of these stories were sold each week, a testament to their popularity and the public's appetite for the macabre. Penny dreadfuls were more than just pulp fiction. They were a cultural phenomenon. They mirrored the anxieties and aspirations of a society in flux, grappling with the rapid changes of industrialization and urbanization. The tales often reflected the fears of an emerging modern world, lawlessness, the supernatural, and the unknown lurking around every cobbled street corner. For many Victorians, these stories were a way to confront, and sometimes conquer, their deepest fears from the comfort of their armchairs. But let's not get too swept up in the romance of it all. The popularity of penny dreadfuls also highlighted a significant societal divide. While they were devoured by the working class, they were often derided by the elite as corrosive garbage, corrupting young minds and morals. It's a familiar refrain echoed through the ages, whether it's rock and roll, video games, or TikTok today. The eternal struggle between generations over what constitutes proper entertainment is nothing new under the sun, or the gaslight, for that matter. In the grand tapestry of Victorian entertainment, these diverse elements, opium dens, freak shows, and penny dreadfuls, were threads woven with both allure and danger. They offered a mirror to the era's complexities, reflecting the tensions between progress and tradition, curiosity and fear. And as the gas lamps flickered to life in the evening streets, the city teetered on the edge of another night, filled with both wonder and the uncanny. So, as you find yourself immersed in this kaleidoscope of Victorian amusements, remember that behind the veneer of charm lies a world grappling with its own contradictions. It was an age that sought to escape reality, while simultaneously confronting it, a paradox that still resonates in our own pursuit of entertainment today. The night is young, and the Victorian stage is set for more revelations and reflections. Stay tuned, because the final act promises to be as intriguing as it is enlightening. As the gas lamps flickered to life in the evening streets, painting the cobblestones with a warm glow, it's time to delve into the nighttime drama of Victorian medical emergencies and mental health practices. Spoiler alert, if you're expecting a compassionate healthcare system or a progressive approach to mental well-being, you're in for a rude awakening. Victorian medicine was a bit like trying to fix a broken leg with a band-aid, only the band-aid is made of arsenic. Let's start with the grim realities of medical emergencies. Imagine you're a Victorian with a nasty gash from a factory accident or a street brawl. Remember that obstacle course of mud and muck. Your options for treatment are about as appealing as a bed of nails. Anesthesia was still in its toddler years, having only been introduced in the 1840, and antiseptics were more of a suggestion than a standard practice. Joseph Lister would eventually champion antiseptic methods in the 1860, but until then, surgery was a race against time and infection. Surgeons worked quickly, not because they were efficiency experts, but because the longer the procedure, the higher the chance you'd end up with a one-way ticket to the afterlife. They were the rock stars of their day, and not just because they were cutting edge, literally. Now, let's talk numbers. In a London hospital around 1850, survival rates for surgeries were dismal. About 50% of patients succumbed to post-operative infections. The medical community was still getting its head around the germ theory, so hygiene was more of a happy accident than a deliberate practice. Instruments were often reused without cleaning, a scenario that would make a modern surgeon faint. It was a world where even a simple cut could spiral into a life-threatening infection faster than you could say staphylococcus. On the mental health front, things were equally bleak. Victorian asylums were less about healing and more about getting those who didn't fit the mold out of sight. If you were deemed mad, you'd be shipped off to what was essentially a human warehouse. By the mid-19th century, there were over 100 asylums in England alone, housing tens of thousands of individuals. Conditions varied, but many were overcrowded and underfunded, with patients subjected to treatments that were as effective as using a sieve to carry water. Treatments ranged from the dubious to the downright dangerous. Hydrotherapy, for instance, involved dousing patients with cold water to shock them into sanity. Instead of providing clarity, it often left them with nothing more than a cold and a sense of profound confusion. Then there was the rotating chair, a device that spun patients at dizzying speeds, supposedly to realign their humors. Spoiler, it didn't work unless the goal was to make patients too dizzy to protest. In the Victorian mindset, mental illness was often seen as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. This stigma meant that many people hid their struggles, fearing social ostracism more than the illness itself. Those who did end up in asylums were often forgotten by society, their stories swept under the rug of Victorian propriety. The idea of mental health as something that needed care and understanding was a concept still decades away. Yet, despite the grim reality, the Victorians were enamored with the idea of progress. They were convinced that science would unlock the secrets of the mind and body, even as they stumbled through the dark. It's a testament to human optimism, or perhaps delusion, that they pressed on with such fervor, convinced that a breakthrough was just around the corner. So, as the night deepens and the weight of the day settles in, it's worth reflecting on the romanticized image of the Victorian era. We're often seduced by visions of grand ballrooms, elegant attire, and the gentle glow of candlelight. But beneath that polished veneer was a world grappling with profound challenges. It was an era where innovation and ignorance danced a delicate waltz, each step forward matched by a step back into the shadows of misunderstanding. It's easy to look back and judge, to scoff at the absurdities of leeches and rotating chairs. But let's not forget that the Victorians were pioneers in their own right, paving the way for the medical advancements we take for granted today. They were products of their time, navigating a world on the brink of modernity with the tools they had, however flawed. As you prepare to leave behind the cobblestones and candlelit corridors of the Victorian world, take a moment to appreciate the comforts of modern life. The next time you pop an ibuprofen or book a therapy session, remember the path paved by those who came before. The Victorians may not have gotten everything right, but their legacy is one of relentless pursuit, a reminder that progress is a journey, not a destination. So there you have it, a day in the life of a Victorian sanatorium, where the line between healing and harm was as thin as the paper on which penny dreadfuls were printed. It's a world that's both fascinating and frightening, offering a cautionary tale wrapped in a layer of historical intrigue. As you slip back into the present, perhaps with a sigh of relief, carry with you the lessons of the past, both the brilliance and the blunders, as you navigate the complexities of your own era. If you think medieval peasants were a bunch of dirt-encrusted Neanderthals, barely scraping by in the filth of their own ignorance, you might want to sit down for this one. Let's dive into the surprisingly tidy world of medieval hygiene, a realm way cleaner than the grime-coated myth would have you believe. Spoiler alert. The common folk weren't running around like extras in a post-apocalyptic film set. In fact, they had some pretty nifty tricks up their sleeves for staying fresh. Sure, the Middle Ages might not have featured the latest in high-tech sanitation like your modern-day bathroom, but let's give credit where it's due. Those folks knew a thing or two about cleanliness. For starters, the medieval peasant wasn't exactly rolling in mud for fun. Bathing was a thing, an actual, regular thing. And it wasn't just reserved for the elite who could afford to splash around in their lavish tubs. Peasants often took dips in rivers, streams, or public bathhouses. Yeah, that's right, they had public bathhouses. These were pretty popular in medieval Europe, long before plumbing came along to steal the spotlight. Now let's talk about soap. Believe it or not, they had it, and they used it. Made from a delightful blend of animal fat and wood ash, medieval soap might not win any awards for fragrance, but it got the job done. For those who could afford it, fancy Castile soap from Spain was all the rage, sporting olive oil as its base. By the 13th century, soap-making had evolved into a proper craft, and soap was being produced commercially in cities like Marseille and Savona. And if you're still picturing peasants with teeth like broken piano keys, think again. Dental hygiene wasn't entirely neglected. Chewing on herbs like parsley and mint was a common way to freshen breath, and toothpicks were used to keep those chompers clean. Some medieval folks even used a concoction of crushed almonds, salt, and vinegar as a rudimentary toothpaste. Not exactly minty fresh, but it was a start. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of medieval sanitation. If you're imagining streets lined with refuse and noxious smells wafting through the air, you're, well, partially right. City streets weren't exactly spotless, but there was an awareness of cleanliness. Municipal ordinances often required residents to keep the area in front of their homes clean. In London, for instance, a 14th century regulation demanded that all refuse be removed to designated disposal sites outside the city walls. Violators could be fined, proving that medieval authorities took cleanliness seriously, even if their methods seem a bit rudimentary by today's standards. Toilets, or rather latrines, were a mixed bag. Wealthy households might boast a private garderobe, essentially a hole in the floor that dropped waste into a pit below. For the less affluent, there were communal latrines, often located over rivers or streams to whisk waste away. Not exactly a luxury suite, but functional. And let's not forget the gong farmers, those unsung heroes tasked with the delightful job of cleaning out cesspits. They'd work at night, shoveling waste into carts to be taken away. Not the most glamorous gig, but someone had to do it. Water supply was another area where medieval people showed some savvy. Cities had public fountains fed by aqueducts or wells, ensuring access to fresh water. Bathhouses, by the way, weren't just for bathing. They were social hubs where people gathered to relax, catch up on gossip, and even conduct business. It's like your local coffee shop, minus the espresso machine, and plus a lot of steam. So, why does the myth of the filthy medieval peasant persist? Probably because the truth is less entertaining than the image of a society wallowing in its own muck. Plus, let's face it, the allure of the exotic, the strange, and the dirty is a powerful narrative. It's easy to assume that people in the past were less sophisticated than we are today, but the reality is often more nuanced. They were just working with the tools they had, making do in ways that might surprise us. In the end, medieval folks were doing their best to stay clean in a world that didn't make it easy. They weren't wallowing in filth. They were navigating a complex landscape of practical solutions and social expectations. So next time someone trots out the old cliché of the filthy medieval peasant, you can set the record straight. Those peasants might not have had smartphones or indoor plumbing, but they knew the value of a good scrub. Now that we've wiped the grime off medieval peasants, let's pivot to another medieval icon who's been polished to a blinding sheen by the sands of time, the knight in shining armor. Ah, the knight, that paragon of chivalry and courage, right? Well, hold your horses, or rather your destriers, because the reality of medieval knighthood is a bit less glamorous than the tales of Arthur and his round table would have you believe. First off, let's talk about the armor, that dazzling shell of metal that supposedly turned every knight into an invincible warrior. While it's true that a suit of armor was a technological marvel of its time, it wasn't exactly an off-the-rack purchase. A full set of armor could set you back as much as a modern luxury car, and I'm not talking about the compact models. We're looking at a cool 40 to 60 pounds in weight, and about 40 to 200 shillings back in the day, translating roughly to several $1,000s today. Not exactly pocket change for your average medieval Joe. And here's a fun fact. Knights couldn't just waltz into battle, glinting in the sun like a human disco ball. Armor needed regular maintenance, and surprise, surprise, it wasn't the knight himself who did it. Enter the squire, the unsung backstage hands in the medieval theatre of war. These young lads were tasked with lugging armor around, polishing it to a mirror shine, and ensuring that so whatever his name was didn't end up in a rusty heap on the battlefield. So, next time you picture a knight bravely charging into combat, spare a thought for the poor squire who spent his nights scrubbing away like a medieval mister. Clean. But let's not get carried away by the allure of shiny metal. Knights weren't the solitary heroes charging into glorious battle as Hollywood loves to depict. In reality, medieval warfare was a team sport with a complex class structure. Sure, knights were the quarterback, but they needed their offensive line. Enter the infantry, the archers, pikemen, and foot soldiers who made up the bulk of medieval armies. These guys were the backbone, often recruited from the peasantry, and they certainly didn't have the benefit of steel-plated protection. Instead, they relied on leather, chainmail, and a prayer or two to keep them safe. And here's where the plot thickens. The romantic image of the fearless knight tends to gloss over the fact that these battles were less about valor and more about strategy, and sometimes sheer luck. A knight's effectiveness in battle was often determined by the quality of his horse, his squire's efficiency, and the state of the battlefield itself. Muddy terrain could turn the most gallant charge into a clumsy slip-and-slide. It wasn't all dragon-slaying and princess rescuing. Speaking of princesses, let's address the chivalric code, that noble ethos that supposedly governed a knight's every move. While tales of courtly love and noble deeds are charming, they're more fiction than fact. The chivalric code, in reality, was a loose collection of ideals that few knights adhered to strictly. It was more about maintaining social order, and less about rescuing damsels in distress. After all, the Middle Ages were a time when power dynamics were as rigid as a knight's armor, and maintaining the status quo was often priority number one. Now, let's plunge into the wonderfully mundane world of knightly duties beyond the battlefield. Far from living a life of constant adventure, knights were often bogged down by administrative tasks and land management. Many were landowners who spent more time dealing with tenant disputes and collecting rents than swinging swords. Even the vaunted jousts, those theatrical displays of martial prowess, were as much about politics and networking as they were about combat. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a corporate retreat, with less PowerPoint and more pointy sticks. And then there's the whole business of becoming a knight. It wasn't just about being born into the right family or showing some promise with a sword. There was a bureaucratic process involved, pledges of loyalty, oaths of service, and often a financial investment from the family. Oh, and did I mention the cost of the armor again? Because yes, it was a significant factor. Knights were expected to be well-equipped, and that often meant their families had to shell out a small fortune. So why do we cling to the myth of the knight in shining armor? Well, it's a good story, isn't it? The notion of a lone warrior standing against the forces of evil is timeless. It appeals to our sense of heroism, and the idea that one person can make a difference. It's a narrative as shiny and polished as the armor itself. But real life, as always, is more complex. Knights were part of a broader military system, bound by the economics, politics, and social norms of their time. They were humans encased in metal, navigating a world as challenging and intricate as the chainmail they wore. In our next exploration, we'll continue to delve into the world of medieval warfare and the roles of the myriad individuals who played a part. From the foot soldiers trudging in the muck to the generals drawing up battle plans, there's plenty more to uncover. Stay tuned as we peel back the layers of myth to reveal the gritty realities beneath. As our exploration of medieval realities continues, let's pivot to a topic that could make a few eyebrows arch higher than a medieval cathedral ceiling: the undeniable power and influence wielded by women during this era. Forget the damsels in distress and the tales of passive maidens waiting for knights in shining armor. The truth is, medieval women were far from powerless. They were more like the unsung CEOs of the feudal world, navigating the treacherous waters of politics, economy, and social norms with the finesse of a juggler at a royal fair. Take Elena of Aquitaine, for example. If medieval Europe were a chessboard, Elena would be the queen piece, moving in all directions and making strategic plays that left kings and nobles alike scrambling to keep up. Born in 1122, Elena was one of the most powerful and wealthy women of her time, inheriting the vast duchy of Aquitaine, which was more than just a pretty patch of land. It was an economic powerhouse. By marrying King Louis Roman VII of France and later Henry Roman II of England, Elena wielded influence over two of the most significant kingdoms in Europe. She wasn't just a queen consort. She was a political player, a patron of the arts, and a mother to two future kings, Richard the Lionheart and John of England. Elena's story isn't an outlier. Women in medieval times often managed estates, especially when their husbands were off fighting wars or playing political games. These ladies weren't just keeping the castle warm. They were overseeing agricultural production, managing finances, and handling legal disputes. Picture them as medieval multitaskers, balancing their roles with the dexterity of a modern-day executive juggling spreadsheets and conference calls. Then there's Christine de Pizan, a name that should be as familiar as any medieval knight, yet often isn't. Born in 1364, Christine was one of the first women in Europe to earn a living as a writer. She wasn't penning grocery lists or love letters. She was crafting political and philosophical treatises that challenged the misogynistic norms of her time. Her most famous work, the Book of the City of Ladies, is essentially a medieval manifesto on gender equality, arguing for women's education and intellectual capability. Christine's words were like arrows shot through the veil of ignorance, challenging the status quo with every quill stroke. Let's not forget the economic clout women held, often understated but undeniably significant. In towns and cities, women participated in guilds and ran businesses, sometimes even inheriting their husband's trade upon his death. In some places, like England and Flanders, women worked in textiles, brewing, and even the lucrative wool trade. The medieval economy wasn't a boys' club. It was a complex web where women were key players, spinning threads both literal and metaphorical. While we're myth-busting, how about the notion that medieval women were stuck in domestic drudgery? Sure, household management was part of the gig, but it wasn't the entirety of their existence. Women of all classes found ways to exert influence outside the home. Noble women could act as regents for their underage sons or absent husbands, wielding real political power. Even in religious life, where women were often cloistered, they could become abbesses, overseeing vast tracts of land and influencing religious and social policies. Think of them as the original bosses of non-profit organizations, steering spiritual and economic ships with divine precision. Joan of Arc is another testament to the complexities of female power in the Middle Ages. Her story is the stuff of legends, but the reality is even more fascinating. A peasant girl who claimed divine inspiration, Joan convinced a dithering French prince to let her lead troops into battle during the 100 Years' War. Dressed in armor, she became a symbol of French resistance, leading to the coronation of Charles Roman VII. Her eventual trial and execution as a heretic didn't diminish her impact. It only cemented her status as a martyr and a saint. Joan's tale is a potent reminder that courage and conviction often come from the most unexpected places. Now, you might be wondering why these powerful women aren't as celebrated as their male counterparts. The answer is as complex as a medieval tapestry, woven with threads of historical bias, male-dominated narratives, and the romanticization of the past. The idea of passive, powerless medieval women appeals to a simpler, albeit inaccurate, story where men are the undisputed heroes. It's a tale that overlooks the nuanced realities of gender dynamics in a time when women were often the silent architects of their own destinies. So, the next time someone waxes poetic about the helpless medieval maiden, feel free to pipe up with the facts. Medieval women were far from passive. They were active participants in shaping the world around them, whether from thrones, abbeys, or the bustling heart of a medieval town. They were the unsung heroines of their time, and their stories, much like the castles they inhabited, have withstood the test of time. As we leave these remarkable women to continue their silent vigil over the pages of history, we'll turn our gaze to the men and women who fought the battles, not with swords and lances, but with numbers and letters. Stay tuned as we delve into the world of medieval scribes and scholars, the intellectual powerhouses who laid the foundations for the Renaissance, while everyone else was busy jousting and politicking. And now, let's pivot from those cerebral scribes to the stone-cold reality of medieval castles, those towering symbols of power that have been scrubbed clean by the Disney-fied brush of time. Forget the visions of ballrooms and banquets. Castles were less luxury living and more military might with a side of drafty discomfort. First up, let's talk about the primary purpose of these stone behemoths: defense. Castles were the medieval equivalent of a nuclear deterrent. You see, back in the day, a castle's imposing walls weren't just for show. They were designed to withstand sieges that could drag on for months. Picture battlements bristling with archers, arrow slits that doubled as medieval sniper nests, and moats deep enough to make a duck think twice. Day at a time, consider the walls of Dover Castle in England, which were a staggering 20 feet thick in places. That's like trying to break into Fort Knox with a butter knife. And it wasn't just the walls that were intimidating. The layout itself was a masterclass in defensive design, with concentric rings of fortifications that dared attackers to make it through without losing a limb or their will to fight. But life inside these fortresses, not exactly a fairy tale. Castles were cold, damp, and generally about as cozy as a cave. Heating was a luxury reserved for the Great Hall, where a roaring fire might keep the lord's toes toasty while everyone else shivered in their straw beds. And let's not even talk about the toilet situation. Spoiler, chamber parts were a staple, and the garderobe, a hole-in-the-wall affair, offered the added bonus of a chilly draft while you did your business. Now, you might be thinking, surely they had tapestries to keep the chill at bay. True, but these weren't just for warmth or decoration. Tapestries were also a status symbol, flaunting the lord's wealth and connections. In a world where Instagram was centuries away, hanging an elaborate tapestry was the medieval equivalent of posting a vacation pic from the French Riviera. Moving on to the economic brain of the operation, castles were also the administrative hubs of their domains. The lord acted like a medieval CEO, managing estates, settling disputes and collecting taxes. If you thought red tape was a modern invention, think again. The paperwork, parchment work, was endless. There were grain inventories, livestock counts, and tax records to maintain. Think of it as an Excel spreadsheet, only written with quill and ink, and with zero undo button. And those banquets you've heard about, they were less about luxury dining and more about political theatre. Sure, there were roasted meats, pies, and enough ale to float a small ship, but these gatherings were strategic displays of wealth and power. Invitations were extended not just to friends, but also to potential rivals, a reminder of who had the bigger moat and army. Speaking of armies, castles were also military bases. The lord was a feudal commander, responsible for rallying his knights and men-at-arms when the king called. Picture the castle's courtyard bustling with the clang of armor and the shouts of drill sergeants. This wasn't just for show. These men were the medieval equivalent of a standing army, ready to defend the realm or march to war at a moment's notice. And let's not forget the castle's role as a safe haven. When marauding bands or rival nobles came calling, the local peasants would seek refuge within its walls. This wasn't out of sheer kindness. It was a calculated move to protect the workforce that kept the estates running. After all, a castle without peasants is like a smartphone without a charger, pretty to look at, but ultimately useless. So, what's the appeal of the castle myth? Well, who doesn't love a good story about lords and ladies, gallant knights, and grand feasts? The romantic image of the castle is a powerful metaphor for strength and chivalry, a narrative that smooths over the rough edges of history. But in reality, these stone fortresses were complex machines of war and governance, as much about political maneuvering as they were about protection. In the end, medieval castles were the ultimate multitaskers, serving as homes, fortresses, and administrative centers. They were the nerve centers of medieval life, where power was wielded and history was shaped. Next time you find yourself swept up in the romantic allure of a castle's silhouette against the sky, remember the practical realities lurking in its shadows. As we continue our journey through the Middle Ages, we'll dive deeper into the lives of those who called these fortresses home and the unsung laborers who kept the medieval world turning. Stay tuned for more tales of grit and grandeur. As we continue our journey through the Middle Ages, let's shift our gaze from those imposing castles and their strategic walls to the period often unfairly branded as the Dark Ages. If you're picturing a time when intellectual life took a permanent coffee break, think again. The so-called Dark Ages were anything but dark. In fact, they were a time of vibrant intellectual and cultural developments that would make your high school history textbook blush with embarrassment. First up, let's tackle the myth of intellectual stagnation head-on. Sure, the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD did shake things up a bit, like a toddler with a snow globe. But rather than plunging Europe into a 1,000-year nap, it set the stage for a fascinating era of innovation and cultural exchange. Enter the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire's snazzy reboot, which kept the flame of classical knowledge burning brighter than a medieval bonfire. They preserved and expanded upon Greek and Roman texts, essentially acting as the intellectual lifeguards of the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, over in the Islamic world, scholars were busy translating and building upon these classical works, which would later trickle back into Europe like a knowledge avalanche. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the 9th century, was an intellectual powerhouse, attracting scholars from across the known world. It was like the Silicon Valley of medieval academia, where the brightest minds came to exchange ideas and spark innovation. Algebra, for instance, didn't just drop from the sky. It was developed by Persian mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, whose name, scrambled through the linguistic blender of history, gives us the word algorithm. Next time your computer glitches, you know who to thank or curse. And let's not forget Charlemagne, the Frankish king who decided he wasn't content with just being another guy with a sword and a crown. In the late 8th century, he kick-started the Carolingian Renaissance, a cultural and intellectual revival that saw a surge in the creation of monasteries and schools. This wasn't just about teaching monks to read. It was about preserving knowledge, including Latin literature and the works of ancient philosophers. Charlemagne's court became a hub of learning, drawing scholars like Alcuin of York, who helped reform the educational system. If you ever had to slog through a Latin class, you might have Charlemagne to blame, but at least you can console yourself with the fact that he was trying to make Europe smart again. Meanwhile, let's zip over to the Irish monastic schools. They were like the Hogwarts of the Dark Ages, only with more manuscripts and fewer magical creatures. Irish monks meticulously copied classical texts, preserving them for future generations. Their illuminated manuscripts, like the Book of Kells, are visual feasts of artistry and devotion, each page a testament to the cultural vibrancy of the era. Imagine spending years hunched over parchment, painstakingly inking intricate designs by candlelight. Those monks were the original hipsters, crafting beauty before it was cool. Then there's the matter of technological innovation. The Dark Ages saw some serious engineering feats that would put modern do-it-yourselfers to shame. Take the heavy plough, for instance. It revolutionized agriculture in northern Europe by allowing farmers to till rich, clay-heavy soils, boosting food production and population growth. This wasn't just a new gadget. It was a game-changer, transforming medieval economies and societies. And let's not forget the watermill, which harnessed the power of nature to grind grain, saw wood, and even crush ore. It was the medieval equivalent of hitting the jackpot on the energy front. And what about art and architecture? The Middle Ages gave us the Romanesque and Gothic architectural styles, which are anything but dull. Romanesque architecture, with its thick walls and rounded arches, was all about solidity and grandeur. Then came the Gothic style, which took things up a notch with its flying buttresses and towering spires. The cathedrals of this period, like Notre Dame de Paris, are marvels of engineering and aesthetics, each stone a testament to the era's creative spirit. These weren't just places of worship. They were statements of faith and ambition, reaching for the heavens both literally and metaphorically. Let's not ignore the literary achievements of the era. The epic poem Beowulf, written in Old English, is an adventurous romp of heroism and monster-slaying that laid the groundwork for countless fantasy sagas. In Italy, Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy took readers on a journey through the afterlife, blending theology, philosophy, and a dash of poetic flair. These works weren't just bedtime stories. They were complex narratives that explored human nature and morality, challenging readers to think deeply about the world and their place in it. So why does the myth of the Dark Ages persist? Perhaps it's because the term itself is a relic of Renaissance and Enlightenment scholars who needed a foil to highlight their own achievements. It's a catchy narrative, the idea of a cultural blackout followed by a glorious reawakening. But it's also misleading. The reality is that the Middle Ages were a time of continuity and innovation, where the seeds of the Renaissance were quietly taking root. In the end, the so-called Dark Ages were anything but. They were a time of dynamic change, where ideas and cultures mingled to create a rich tapestry of knowledge and creativity. The myth of the Dark Ages, as a period of intellectual slumber, is just that. A myth. The truth is far more interesting. A period of transition and transformation that laid the groundwork for the world we know today. So next time someone tosses around the term Dark Ages as shorthand for cultural stagnation, you can set the record straight. The Middle Ages were a complex and fascinating time, where the shadows of history were illuminated by the bright sparks of human ingenuity. As we wrap up this exploration of medieval myths and realities, let's remember that history is never as black and white as it seems. It's a kaleidoscope of stories, each angle offering a fresh perspective, and the Middle Ages are no exception. With that, we conclude our journey through this misunderstood era, having busted myths, unearthed truths, and hopefully left you with a new appreciation for the medieval mind. Here's to the past, complex, colorful, and anything but dark. And here's to you, dear listener, for coming along for the ride. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop seeking the stories that lie beneath the surface of history's grand tapestry. There's nothing quite like waking up to the smell of smoke, is there? Except this time, it's not your imagination or your questionable cooking skills. It's 64 AD, and Rome, the heart of the empire, is on fire. A fire that's not just a tiny spark. It's a raging inferno devouring the city like a lion at a gladiator feast. Welcome to chaos, my friend. As a Roman citizen, your day just took a turn for the historically significant. Nearly 70% of Rome is ablaze, and you're watching the fire leap from building to building, each more flammable than the last. The city's famous for its grandeur, but right now it's infamous for being a tinderbox. Out of 14 districts, 10 are getting an extreme makeover, courtesy of flames. If Rome was Instagrammable before, it's now the world's hardest mess, literally. Now, let's talk firefighting, Roman style. Forget about fire engines. Think more along the lines of a bucket brigade wearing sandals and togas. Water supply. Good luck with that. Rome's aqueducts are a marvel of engineering, sure, but they aren't exactly designed for a fire emergency. It's like trying to put out a bonfire with a leaky wine goblet. And speaking of goblets, those are more likely being used to rescue the most precious liquid of all, wine. Priorities, right. In the midst of this, you might be wondering, where's Emperor Nero? Ah, Nero. The man, the myth, the misunderstood musician. Let's set the record straight. Nero wasn't fiddling while Rome burned. For starters, the fiddle wasn't even invented yet. What he was doing, however, is a bit of a historical mystery. Some sources say he was back at his villa in Antium, composing poetry and planning a comeback tour. Others claim he rushed back to Rome, organized relief efforts, and opened up his own palaces to the newly homeless. Either way, his public relations team could have used some serious damage control training. But let's not get too cozy with the romantic image of Nero as the tragic artist. The reality is more complex and less flattering. Nero's reign was marked by extravagance bordering on insanity. This was a guy who once had a 120-foot statue of himself built, just because. So, while the myth of Nero strumming away as Rome went up in flames is catchy, the truth is more about power plays and political maneuvering. He blamed the Christians for the fire, sparking the first major persecution of this fledgling group. Not exactly a gold star in the history books. Back on the ground, you're dealing with the immediate aftermath. Homes are gone, the forums are wreck, and the temple of Jupiter is a smoldering ruin. The economic hit is colossal, with entire livelihoods turned to ash. But you, like many Romans, are nothing if not resourceful. There's no government bailout, so it's time to lean on family and friends, maybe even migrate to one of the few districts that escaped the blaze. While you're trying to salvage what's left of your life, the political games are just heating up. Nero sees this as an opportunity. Where others see devastation, he sees potential for a new, grander Rome. He envisions a city rebuilt with wider streets and grand palaces, a Rome that reflects his own grandiose image. But first, he needs to convince the Senate and the people that this is a good idea, and that he's not the pyromaniac whispering sweet nothings to the flames. As you navigate this charred landscape, you're witnessing a pivotal moment in history. The Great Fire of Rome is more than just a disaster. It's a turning point. It exposes the vulnerabilities of Rome's infrastructure, the volatility of its politics, and the resilience of its people. It's a story of destruction, renewal, and of course a little bit of scandal. So as you stand there, soot-covered and slightly crispy around the edges, remember, you're part of this epic tale. Rome will rise again, as it always does. And you, dear Roman, will have one hell of a story to tell. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of the aftermath, where the economy is looking as burned out as the Forum. You see, rebuilding Rome wasn't just about stacking bricks and calling it a day. It was a Herculean task that involved more sesterces than you can shake a laurel wreath at. Picture this. Nero, standing there in his toga, with plans not just for a new Rome, but a new and improved Rome. Oh, and with a price tag that would make even the most generous patron of the arts gulp. A whopping 300,000 sesterces per building. That's right. Nero's vision involved a city that wouldn't just rise from the ashes, but would do so with the panache of a peacock at a pigeon party. Now, before you start imagining Nero as some kind of ancient HGTV host, let's address the elephant, or rather, the golden house, in the room, the Domus Aurea. Nero's plans included this lavish palace complex, complete with man-made lakes and gardens, that would make Versailles look like a backyard barbecue. But let's not get too swept up in the architectural romance. The reality, Nero's grand designs were as much about vanity as they were about urban planning. Sure, the city got wider streets and fire-resistant bricks, but let's not kid ourselves. It was also about Nero wanting to see his reflection in every marble column. As Rome embarked on its extreme makeover, the Senate wasn't exactly sold on Nero's fireproof vision. After all, 300,000 sesterces could buy a lot of things like, say, an army or 10. But Nero, ever the showman, pitched his plans as not just necessary, but as a gift to the people. A Rome that was safer, more grandiose, and, let's face it, more Nero-esque. So, with a little persuasion and a lot of imperial decree, the reconstruction began. On the ground, though, it was a different story. As a Roman citizen, your life was less about visionary blueprints and more about practical survival. With homes reduced to rubble and livelihoods turned to dust, the average Roman was scrambling to make ends meet. Rents skyrocketed as housing became scarcer than a virtuous senator. And while Nero might have been dreaming of marble columns, you were probably more concerned with finding a roof over your head that didn't cost an arm and a leg, or both. Let's talk about those 300,000 sesterces per building for a moment. To put it in context, a single sestus was roughly the daily wage of a skilled laborer. So, for the average Roman, that kind of money was like trying to imagine the GDP of a small nation. It was a sum so astronomical that it made climbing Mount Olympus sound like a weekend hike. And yet, this was the price tag for Nero's fireproof utopia. But here's the kicker. Despite all the grand designs and hefty price tags, the reality of reconstruction was a series of compromises. Not every building got the full luxury treatment. Many citizens had to rebuild using whatever materials they could scrounge up, often reverting to the same flammable substances that had fueled the fire in the first place. It was a classic case of champagne dreams on a vinegar budget. Meanwhile, the myth of Nero's grandiose plans continued to swirl. Was he a visionary or a villain? The truth is, he was probably a bit of both. Nero's ambitions were as much about legacy as they were about safety. He wanted to be remembered not just as an emperor, but as a transformative force in Roman history. But in aiming for immortality, he often overlooked the immediate needs of his people. As the city slowly rose from its ashes, the social fabric of Rome was being rewoven, thread by thread. The fire had exposed not just the physical vulnerabilities of Rome, but also the social and economic ones. It was a wake-up call that Rome, for all its glory, was as fragile as a house of cards. And as you navigated this new landscape, you were not just a spectator, but a participant in a grand historical experiment. In the midst of these challenges, Romans did what they did best: adapt. The black market thrived as people traded goods for essentials, and communities banded together to support one another. It wasn't just about rebuilding homes, it was about rebuilding lives. The resilience of the Roman people became the true foundation upon which the new city was built. So, as you wander through the charred remains of yesterday's Rome, take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of it all. Nero's plans might have been over the top, but they were also a testament to the eternal spirit of the city. Rome would rise again, not because of one man's vision, but because of the collective will of its people. And as a Roman, you're right in the thick of it, living through a moment that would shape the future of the empire. With each new building that went up, with every street that was widened, the city was not just reconstructing its architecture, but redefining its identity. And so, the saga of Rome continued, with you and your fellow citizens as the authors of its next chapter. A story of survival, reinvention, and of course, a little bit of scandal. Because what's Rome without a touch of drama? As Rome's new identity took shape amidst the dust and ashes, let's hit pause on the architectural makeover and zoom in on something juicier: the blame game. Because let's face it, in ancient Rome, pointing fingers was practically an Olympic sport. And no one played it better than Nero, our resident drama emperor. After all, every good story needs a villain, right? Enter the Christians, stage left, unsuspecting, and about to be thrust into the harsh Roman spotlight. First, let's set the scene. The fire of 64 AD wasn't just an urban catastrophe, it was a political powder keg, and Nero needed a scapegoat faster than you could say, et tu, brute. Now, Christians in Rome at this time were a small, peculiar sect, just trying to keep their heads down and avoid the wrath of Jupiter and friends. But to Nero, they were the perfect patsies. Why? Well, their refusal to worship Roman gods made them about as popular as a toga party without wine. Plus, they had this radical idea of a heavenly kingdom, which, to Roman ears, sounded suspiciously like an anti-establishment anthem. So Nero did what any self-respecting despot would do. He pointed at the Christians and yelled, "Them! They did it!" Cue the first major persecution of Christians. Now, before you imagine Nero as some kind of Roman Sherlock Holmes, let's remember that this was less about evidence and more about convenience. The Christians were easy targets, and blaming them was a masterstroke of political theatre. But here's where it gets interesting. The persecution wasn't just about punishment. It was Nero's twisted form of public relations. You see, by casting the Christians as arsonists, Nero deflected attention from his own questionable role in the disaster. It was like a magician's trick. Look over here while I do something over there. The Roman populace, desperate for answers and someone to blame, bought into it. After all, who doesn't love a good scapegoat? The details of the persecution are as grim as they are grotesque. Nero, never one to do things by halves, orchestrated a series of public spectacles that would make even the most jaded Roman cringe. We're talking about Christians being covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, or, in a move that would make even the most avant-garde theatre director blush, being set alight to illuminate Nero's garden parties. Yes, you heard that right. Human torches at a soiree. And you thought your boss's parties were awkward. But let's not get too lost in the grim spectacle. There's a bigger picture here, one that speaks volumes about Roman society and Nero's cunning. By targeting the Christians, Nero not only pacified a restless populace, but also reinforced the social order. It was a stark reminder of who held the power and what happened to those who dared challenge it. The Christians, with their subversive beliefs and refusal to bow to Roman guards, represented a threat to the status quo. Nero's persecution was as much about maintaining control as it was about finding a scapegoat. Of course, this narrative wasn't without its cracks. Even in ancient Rome, there were whispers and doubts about the fairness of Nero's accusations. Tacitus, the Roman historian, noted that many Romans felt sympathy for the Christians, not because they believed in their innocence, but because the punishment seemed excessively brutal. It was a PR move that, while effective in the short term, planted seeds of doubt about Nero's leadership. Yet in the aftermath of the fire, this ruthless scapegoating had a chilling effect on social dynamics. The Christians, already outcasts, found themselves further marginalized. But here's the twist. Persecution, rather than stamping out the sect, actually fanned its flames. The stories of martyrdom spread, drawing more attention and eventually more converts to the Christian cause. It was a classic case of unintended consequences. Nero's attempt to quash a threat only served to amplify it. As the dust settled and Rome rebuilt, the city found itself grappling with deeper questions about power, faith, and identity. Nero's tactics might have temporarily secured his position, but they also exposed the vulnerabilities of an empire that was as fragile as it was grand. The persecution of Christians marked a pivotal moment, not just in Roman history, but in the history of Christianity itself. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, resilience and faith can light the way. So, as you wander through the embers of this tale, take a moment to ponder the complexities of power and the human penchant for blame. In the grand tapestry of history, Nero's actions were but one thread, weaving a narrative of ambition, fear, and the relentless pursuit of control. And as Rome emerged from the ashes, so too did the ideas and beliefs that would ultimately shape the world. In the end, it wasn't just the buildings that rose anew, but the spirit of a people determined to survive and redefine themselves. So, with the echoes of Nero's garden parties fading into the annals of infamy, let's pivot from persecution to pragmatism. Because if there's one thing the Romans were good at, besides empire building and toga draping, it was surviving against the odds. The great fire of Rome might have scorched the city's skyline, but it couldn't extinguish the indomitable Roman spirit. Let's delve into the gritty, resourceful world of post-fire survival strategies, where necessity was the mother of all invention and desperation spurred innovation. Imagine waking up to find that your insula, or apartment block, has been reduced to a smouldering pile of rubble. Sure, it's a bummer, but as a Roman, you're not one to wallow. With no FEMA hotline or insurance policy to fall back on, it's time to get creative or perish. Enter the world of makeshift housing, a hodgepodge of tents, lean tasks, and whatever else could be cobbled together from the remains of yesterday's dreams. The Aventine Hill, previously home to bustling neighborhoods, now resembled a patchwork quilt of temporary shelters, as Romans scrambled to put a roof, any roof, over their heads. And let's not forget the beauty of bartering. In a city where coins were suddenly as scarce as a sober senator, the good old-fashioned trade system made a roaring comeback. Need a sturdy pair of sandals? Better hope you've got some extra grain or oil to swap with your neighbor. The Forum, once the bustling heart of Roman commerce, became a flea market of epic proportions. Everything from food to household goods found its way onto makeshift stalls, where citizens haggled with the fervor of auctioneers on a caffeine high. This wasn't just survival. It was a masterclass in economics 101. Romans were essentially reinventing the supply chain, armed with nothing more than ingenuity and a desperate need for essentials. It was a crash course in resilience, and the curriculum was written in the ashes of destruction. You see, in the absence of a formal safety net, Romans had to rely on the oldest social safety net there was, community. Neighbors became allies. Friends became family. The lines between personal and communal property blurred like a fresco in a rainstorm. Now, let's talk economics. The fire had torched more than just homes. It had set the Roman economy ablaze, leaving a charred landscape of financial ruin. With the city's grain supply disrupted, prices skyrocketed faster than you could say Caesar's salad. If you think inflation is bad now, imagine your daily bread suddenly costing double, and that's if you could even find any. The cost of rebuilding, both personal and public, put a strain on the treasury that would give even the most experienced Roman banker nightmares. But scarcity breeds resourcefulness. Romans, ever the opportunists, found ways to make do. The black market thrived as much as the legal one, with enterprising individuals selling everything from salvaged building materials to sacred relics. Because, let's face it, there's always a market for a holy knick-knack or two. This was a time when the phrase, "one man's trash is another man's treasure," became a literal survival guide. Even amidst the chaos, there were those who saw opportunity in calamity. Wealthy Romans with a flair for real estate snapped up burnt-out properties, banking on the eventual reconstruction to turn a tidy profit. It was capitalism in its rawest form, with the fate of families hanging in the balance like gladiators in the arena. And let's not sugarcoat it. This was a time when the gap between the haves and the have-nots yawned wider than the Tiber. Despite the odds, the Roman people soldiered on. This wasn't just about physical rebuilding. It was about forging a new sense of identity from the embers of the old. The city's infrastructure, once a marvel of engineering, was being scrutinized and reimagined. New regulations were introduced, mandating wider streets to prevent future fires from spreading with such deadly efficiency. Yes, it was Nero who spearheaded these changes, but it was the collective will of the Roman populace that drove them forward. And as the city slowly rose from the ashes, so too did a new sense of resilience. Romans were learning to adapt, to compromise, and to find strength in unity. It was a transformation as profound as it was chaotic, a reminder that even in the direst of circumstances, humanity's capacity for reinvention knows no bounds. The Great Fire of Rome wasn't just a story of destruction. It was a testament to the power of resilience and the enduring spirit of a people who refused to be defined by their ruins. So, as you navigate the charred alleyways and makeshift markets, remember that you're not just witnessing the aftermath of a disaster. You're part of a living history, a testament to the Roman ability to adapt and survive. In the end, it wasn't just about rebuilding Rome. It was about redefining what it meant to be Roman. And in the grand tapestry of history, that's a legacy that burns brighter than any flame ever could. As the dust settled, and the phoenix that was Rome slowly began to rise from its own ashes, you might be wondering why this fiery chapter remains a hot topic today, pun fully intended. Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into the architectural and societal aftershocks of the Great Fire, as well as the ambitious, albeit questionable, legacy of our pal Nero. Spoiler alert, it's a tale of grand designs, public relations misfires, and lessons that still resonate. First, let's talk architecture. Rome's urban landscape pre-fire was like a tinderbox waiting to happen, a maze of narrow streets and densely packed wooden buildings that practically begged for a spark. If city planners had been around, they would have thrown up their hands in horror. Post-fire, however, Rome took a hard look in the mirror and decided it was time for a makeover. Nero, ever the visionary with a penchant for the extravagant, saw this as an opportunity to transform the city into a monument worthy of his reign. And boy, did he have plans. Gone were the cramped alleys that allowed flames to leapfrog from building to building with the agility of a caffeinated cat. In their place, Nero envisioned wide boulevards, fire-resistant brick constructions, and public squares that would make even the most hardened Romans stop and admire. It's like Nero took a page from a Roman edition of Extreme Makeover, City Edition. But here's the twist. While these changes were undoubtedly necessary, they were also a canvas for Nero's not-so-subtle self-aggrandizement. His Domus Aurea, or Golden House, was less a home and more a sprawling palace complex that screamed, "Look at me," louder than a Roman triumph. But let's not kid ourselves. These changes weren't just about aesthetics or safety. They were a power play, pure and simple. By reshaping Rome's skyline, Nero wasn't just rebuilding a city. He was carving his name into its very foundation. It was an emperor's way of saying, "I was here, and I mattered." Except, in true Nero style, he did it with the subtlety of a chariot racing through a china shop. And while the new Rome was undeniably grander, the cost was staggering, both financially and socially. Fast forward a couple of millennia, and you'll find that Nero's grand designs still echo in the modern world. His urban planning efforts set a precedent for cities grappling with disaster recovery. Sure, the Domus Aurea didn't survive the test of time, or the test of public opinion, but the idea of rebuilding with resilience in mind, that's a legacy that stuck around. Today, architects and city planners continue to grapple with the same issues Nero faced: how to balance safety, aesthetics, and ego. And while we're not suggesting Nero was a visionary in the mold of modern architects, his influence on urban design is undeniable. Speaking of legacies, let's give Nero his due, or at least try to. Nero's reign is a masterclass in historical PR disasters. The man's image is more tarnished than a Roman coin at the bottom of the Tiber. Was he the unhinged tyrant history paints him as, or was he simply misunderstood? The truth is probably somewhere in between, and that's what makes his story so compelling. Nero was a ruler who reveled in the theatrical, whether it was composing music, putting on scandalous performances, or, as some claimed, watching Rome burn with a poetic gleam in his eye. But for all his faults, and there were many, he was also a ruler who dared to dream big. The irony: Nero's larger-than-life persona has made him a legend, albeit a notorious one. His antics have kept historians and dramatists busy for centuries, turning him into a staple of pop culture. He's the guy everyone loves to hate, the villainous emperor who gives even the most colorful Shakespearean characters a run for their denarii. Yet, his story is also a cautionary tale about the intoxicating allure of power and the precarious balance between ambition and madness. So why does the Great Fire of Rome still capture our imagination? Maybe it's because it's a reminder of the fragility of civilization, how quickly the structures we build, both physical and societal, can go up in smoke. Or perhaps it's the human drama, the tales of survival, resilience, and reinvention that resonate with us even today. After all, who doesn't love a good comeback story? In our modern world, where disaster tourism has become a bizarre yet thriving industry, the ruins of Rome serve as a testament to the enduring fascination with catastrophe and recovery. People flock to sites of historical disasters, not just to gawk at the remnants, but to connect with the stories of those who lived through them. It's as if standing among the ruins helps us understand our own vulnerabilities and the eternal human spirit of perseverance. And if there's one takeaway from this fiery saga, it's the importance of having an escape plan, literally and metaphorically. Whether you're navigating the labyrinthine politics of ancient Rome or the complexities of modern life, it's always good to know where the exits are. Because while Nero might have dreamed of eternal glory, the rest of us are just trying to make it through the day with our dignity and sanity intact. So, as you stroll through the annals of history, remember that the Great Fire of Rome wasn't just a chapter of destruction. It was a catalyst for change, a crucible that forged a new Rome from the ashes of the old. It's a story of ambition, survival, and the indomitable human spirit, wrapped in a toga of scandal and intrigue. And as you ponder the legacy of Nero and his fiery moment in the spotlight, take heart in the knowledge that history, much like Rome, is never truly finished. It's always being rebuilt, one story at a time.